The Daughters of the Late Colonel by Catherine Mansfield. 1. The week after was one of the busiest weeks of their lives. Even when they went to bed, it was only their bodies that lay down and rested. Their minds went on, thinking things out, talking things over, wondering, deciding, trying to remember where. Constantia lay like a statue, her hands by her sides, her feet just overlapping each other, the sheet up to her chin. She stared at the ceiling. "Do you think Father would mind if we gave his top hat to the porter?" "The porter?" snapped Josephine. "Why ever the porter? What a very extraordinary idea." "Because," said Constantia slowly, "he must often have to go to funerals, and I noticed at the cemetery that he only had a bowler." She paused. "I thought then how very much he'd appreciate a top hat. We ought to give him a present too. He was always very nice to Father." "But," cried Josephine, flouncing on her pillow and staring across the dark at Constantia, "Father's head." And suddenly, for one awful moment, she nearly giggled. Not, of course, that she felt in the least like giggling. It must have been habit. Years ago, when they'd stayed awake at night talking, their beds had simply heaved. And now the porter's head, disappearing, popped out like a candle under Father's hat. The giggle mounted. She clenched her hands. She fought it down. She frowned fiercely at the dark and said, "Remember," terribly sternly. "We can decide tomorrow," she said. Constantia had noticed nothing. She sighed. "Do you think we ought to have our dressing gowns dyed as well?" "Black!" almost shrieked Josephine. "Well, what else?" said Constantia. "I was thinking, it doesn't seem quite sincere in a way to wear black out of doors and when we're fully dressed, and then when we're at home." "But nobody sees us," said Josephine. She gave the bedclothes such a twitch that both her feet became uncovered, and she had to creep up the pillows to get them well under again. "Kate does," said Constantia, "and the postman very well might." Josephine thought of her dark red slippers which matched her dressing gown, and of Constantia's favourite indefinite green ones which went with hers. Black. 2 black dressing gowns and 2 pairs of black woolly slippers creeping off to the bathroom like black cats. "I don't think it's absolutely necessary," said she. Silence. Then Constantia said, "We shall have to post the papers with the notice in them tomorrow to catch the Ceylon mail. How many letters have we had up till now?" 23. Josephine had replied to them all, and 23 times when she came to "We miss our dear Father so much," she'd broken down and had to use a handkerchief, and on some of them even to soak up a very light blue tear with an edge of blotting paper. Strange. She couldn't have put it on. 23 times. Even now, though, when she said over to herself sadly, "We miss our dear Father so much," she could have cried if she'd wanted to. "Have you got enough stamps?" came from Constantia. "Oh, how can I tell?" said Josephine crossly. "What's the good of asking me that now?" "I was just wondering," said Constantia mildly. Silence again. There came a little rustle, a scurry, a hop. "Mouse," said Constantia. "It can't be a mouse because there aren't any crumbs," said Josephine. "But it doesn't know there aren't," said Constantia. A spasm of pity squeezed her heart. Poor little thing. She wished she'd left a tiny piece of biscuit on the dressing table. It was awful to think of it not finding anything. What would it do? I can't think how they managed to live at all," she said slowly. "Who?" demanded Josephine. And Constantia said more loudly than she meant to, "Mice!" Josephine was furious. "Oh, what nonsense, Con," she said. "What have mice got to do with it? You're asleep." "I don't think I am," said Constantia. She shut her eyes to make sure. She was. Josephine arched her spine, pulled up her knees, folded her arms so that her fists came under her ears, and pressed her cheek hard against the pillow. 2. Another thing which complicated matters was they had Nurse Andrews staying on with them that week. It was their own fault. They had asked her. It was Josephine's idea. On the last morning, when the doctor had gone, Josephine had said to Constantia, "Don't you think it would be rather nice if we asked Nurse Andrews to stay on for a week as our guest?" "Very nice," said Constantia. I thought, went on Josephine quickly, I should just say this afternoon, after I paid her, my sister and I would be very pleased, after all you've done for us, Nurse Andrews, if you would stay on for a week, as our guest. I'd have to put that in about being our guest in case. Oh, but she could hardly expect to be paid, cried Constantia. One never knows, said Josephine sagely. Nurse Andrews had, of course, jumped at the idea, but it was a bother. It meant that they had to have regular sit-down meals at the proper times, whereas, if they'd been alone, they could have just asked Kate if she wouldn't have minded bringing them a tray wherever they were. And meal times now that the strain was over were rather a trial. Nurse Andrews was simply fearful about butter. Really, they couldn't help feeling that about butter at least she took advantage of their kindness. And she had that maddening habit of asking for just an inch more bread to finish what she had on her plate. And then, after the last mouthful, absent-mindedly, of course it wasn't absent-mindedly, taking another helping. Josephine got very red when this happened, and she fastened her small bead-like eyes on the tablecloth as if she saw a minute strange insect creeping through the web of it. But Constantia's long pale face lengthened and set, and she gazed away, far over the desert, to where that line of camels unwound like a thread of wool. "When I was with Lady Tukes," said Nurse Andrews, "she had such a dainty little contrivance for the butter. It was a silver cupid balanced on the border of a glass dish, holding a tiny fork, and when you wanted some butter, you simply pressed his foot and he bent down and speared you a piece. It was quite a game." Josephine could hardly bear that. "But I think those things are very extravagant," was all she said. "But why?" asked Nurse Andrews, beaming through her eyeglasses. "No one, surely, would take more butter than one wanted, would one?" "Ring, Con," cried Josephine. She couldn't trust herself to reply. And proud young Kate, the enchanted princess, came in to see what the old tabbies wanted now. She snatched away their plates of mock something or other and slapped down a white, terrified blancmange. "Jam, please, Kate," said Josephine kindly. Kate knelt and burst open the sideboard, lifted the lid of the jam pot, saw it was empty, put it on the table and stalked off. "I'm afraid," said Nurse Andrews a moment later, "there isn't any." "Oh, what a bother," said Josephine. She bit her lip. "What had we better do?" Constantia looked dubious. "Oh, we can't disturb Kate again," she said softly. Nurse Andrews waited, smiling at them both. Her eyes wandered, spying at everything behind her eyeglasses. Constantia, in despair, went back to her camels. Josephine frowned heavily, concentrated. If it hadn't been for this idiotic woman, she and Con would, of course, have eaten their blancmange without. Suddenly the idea came. "I know," she said. "Marmalade. There's some marmalade in the sideboard. Get it, Con." "I hope," laughed Nurse Andrews, and her laugh was like a spoon tinkling against a medicine glass. "I hope it's not very bitter marmalade." 3. But, after all, it was not long now, and then she'd be gone for good, and there was no getting over the fact that she had been very kind to Father. She had nursed him day and night at the end. Indeed, both Constantia and Josephine felt privately she had rather overdone than not leaving him at the very last. For when they had gone in to say goodbye, Nurse Andrews had sat beside his bed the whole time, holding his wrist and pretending to look at her watch. It couldn't have been necessary. It was so tactless, too. Supposing Father had wanted to say something private to them. Not that he had. Oh, far from it. He lay there, purple, a dark, angry purple in the face, and never even looked at them when they came in. Then, as they were standing there wondering what to do, he'd suddenly opened one eye. Oh, what a difference it would have made. What a difference to their memory of him. How much easier to tell people about it if he had only opened both. But no, one eye only. It glared at them a moment, and then went out. 4. It had made it very awkward for them when Mr. Farrolles of St. John's called the same afternoon. "The end was quite peaceful, I trust," were the first words he said as he glided towards them through the dark drawing-room. "Quite," said Josephine faintly. They both hung their heads. Both of them felt certain that eye wasn't at all a peaceful eye. "Won't you sit down?" said Josephine. "Thank you, Miss Pinner," said Mr. Furrows gratefully. He folded his coat-tails and began to lower himself into Father's armchair, but just as he touched it, he almost sprang up and slid into the next chair instead. Coughed. Josephine clasped her hands. Constantia looked vague. "I want you to feel, Miss Pinner," said Mr. Furrows, "and you, Miss Constantia, that I'm trying to be helpful. I want to be helpful to you both, if you let me. These are the times," said Mr. Furrows, very simply and earnestly, "when God means us to be helpful to one another." "Thank you very much, Mr. Furrows," said Josephine and Constantia. "Not at all," said Mr. Furrows gently. He drew his kid gloves through his fingers and leaned forward. "If either of you would like a little communion, either or both of you, here and now, you have only to tell me. A little communion is often a great comfort," he added tenderly. But the idea of a little communion terrified them. What? In a drawing room, by themselves, with no altar or anything? The piano would be much too high, thought Constantia, and Mr. Furrows couldn't possibly lean over it with a chalice. And Kate would be sure to come bursting in and interrupt them, thought Josephine, and supposing the bell rang in the middle, it might be somebody important about their mourning. Would they get up reverently and go out, or would they have to wait in torture? "Perhaps you will send round a note by your good Kate if you would care for it later," said Mr. Furrows. "Oh, yes, thank you very much," they both said. Mr. Furrows got up and took his black straw hat from the round table. "And about the funeral," he said softly, "I may arrange that as your dear father's old friend and yours, Miss Pinner, and Miss Constantia." Josephine and Constantia got up too. I should like it to be quite simple," said Josephine firmly, "and not too expensive. At the same time, I should like a good one that will last," thought dreamy Constantia, as if Josephine were buying a nightgown. But of course Josephine didn't say that. "One suitable to our father's position." She was very nervous. "I'll run round to our good friend Mr. Knight," said Mr. Furrows soothingly. "I will ask him to come and see you. I am sure you will find him very helpful indeed." 5. Well, at any rate, all that part of it was over, though neither of them would possibly believe that Father was never coming back. Josephine had had a moment of absolute terror at the cemetery, while the coffin was lowered, to think that she and Constantia had done this thing without asking his permission. What would Father say when he found out? For he was bound to find out sooner or later. He always did. "Buried? You two girls have me buried?" She heard his stick thumping. Oh, what would they say? What possible excuse could they make? It sounded such an appallingly heartless thing to do. Such a wicked advantage to take of a person because he happened to be helpless at the moment. The other people seemed to have treated all as a matter of course. They were strangers. They couldn't be expected to understand that Father was the very last person for such a thing to happen to. No, the entire blame for it all would fall on her and Constantia. And the expense, she thought, stepping into the tight-buttoned cab. When she had to show him the bills, what would he say then? She heard him absolutely roaring. "And do you expect me to pay for this gimcrack excursion of yours?" "Oh," groaned poor Josephine aloud, "we shouldn't have done it, Con." And Constantia, pale as a lemon in all that blackness, said in a frightened whisper, "Done what, John?" "Let them bury Father like that," said Josephine, breaking down and crying into her new, queer-smelling mourning handkerchief. "But what else could we have done?" asked Constantia wonderingly. "We couldn't have kept him, John. We couldn't have kept him unburied. At any rate, not in a flat that size." Josephine blew her nose, for the cab was dreadfully stuffy. "I don't know," she said forlornly. "It's all so dreadful. I feel we ought to have tried to, just for a time at least, to make perfectly sure one thing's certain," and her tears sprang out again. "Father will never forgive us for this. Never." 6. Father would never forgive them. That's what they felt more than ever when 2 mornings later they went into his room to go through his things. They had discussed it quite calmly. It was even down on Josephine's list of things to be done. Go through Father's things and settle about them. But that was a very different matter from saying after breakfast, Well, are you ready, Con? Yes, Jug, when you are. Then I think we'd better get it over. It was dark in the hall. It had been a rule for years never to disturb Father in the morning, whatever happened. And now they were going to open the door without knocking even. Constantia's eyes were enormous at the idea. Josephine felt weak in the knees. You go first, she gasped, pushing Constantia. But Constantia said, as she always had said on those occasions, "No, Jug, it's not fair. You're eldest." Josephine was just going to say what at other times she wouldn't have owned to for the world, what she kept for her very last weapon. "But you're tallest," when they noticed that the kitchen door was open and there stood Kate. "Very stiff," said Josephine, grasping the door handle and doing her best to turn it, as if anything ever deceived Kate. It couldn't be helped. The girl was... Then the door was shut behind them. But they weren't in Father's room at all. They might have suddenly walked through the wall by mistake into a different flat altogether. Was the door just behind them? They were too frightened to look. Josephine knew that if it was holding itself tightly shut. Constantia felt like the drawers in dreams. It hadn't any handle at all. It was the coldness which made it so awful. Or the whiteness? Which? Everything was covered. The blinds were down. A cloth hung over the mirror. A sheet hid the bed. A huge fan of white paper filled the fireplace. Constantia timidly put out her hand. She almost expected a snowflake to fall. Josephine felt a queer tingling in her nose, as if her nose was freezing. Then a cab clop-clopped over the cobbles below, and the quiet seemed to shake into little pieces. "I'd better pull up a blind," said Josephine bravely. "Yes, it might be a good idea," whispered Constantia. They only gave the blind a touch, but it flew up, and the cord flew after, rolling round the blind stick, and the little tassel tapped as if trying to get free. That was too much for Constantia. Don't you think we might put it off for another day?" she whispered. "Why?" snapped Josephine, feeling as usual much better now that she knew for certain that Constantia was terrified. "It's got to be done." "But I do wish you wouldn't whisper, Con." "I didn't know I was whispering," whispered Constantia. "And why do you keep staring at the bed?" said Josephine, raising her voice almost defiantly. "There's nothing on the bed." "Oh, Jug, don't say so," said poor Connie. "At any rate, not so loudly." Josephine felt herself that she'd gone too far. She took a wide swerve over to the chest of drawers, put out her hand, but quickly drew it back again. "Connie!" she gasped, and she wheeled round and leaned with her back against the chest of drawers. Oh, Jug, what?" Josephine could only glare. She had the most extraordinary feeling that she had just escaped something simply awful. But how could she explain to Constantia that Father was in the chest of drawers? He was in the top drawer with his handkerchiefs and neckties, or in the next with his shirts and pyjamas, or in the lowest of all with his suits. He was watching there, hidden away, just behind the door handle, ready to spring. She pulled a funny old-fashioned face at Constantia, just as she used to in the old days when she was going to cry. "I can't open," she nearly wailed. "No, don't, Jug," whispered Constantia earnestly. "It's much better not to. Don't let's open anything, at any rate. Not for a long time." But you seem so weak," said Josephine, breaking down. "But why not be weak for once, Jug?" argued Constantia, whispering quite fiercely. "If it is weak." And a pale stare flew from the locked writing table, so safe, to the huge glittering wardrobe, and she began to breathe in a queer, panting way. "Why shouldn't we be weak for once in our lives, Jug? It's quite excusable. Let's be weak. Be weak, Jug. It's much nicer to be weak than to be strong." And then she did one of those amazingly bold things that she'd done about twice before in their lives. She marched over to the wardrobe, turned the key, and took it out of the lock. Took it out of the lock and held it up to Josephine, showing Josephine by her extraordinary smile that she knew what she'd done. She'd risked deliberately Father being in there, among his overcoats. If the huge wardrobe had lurched forward had crashed down on Constantia, Josephine wouldn't have been surprised. On the contrary, she would have thought it the only suitable thing to happen. But nothing happened. Only the room seemed quieter than ever, and bigger flakes of cold air fell on Josephine's shoulders and knees. She began to shiver. "Come, Jug," said Constantia, still with that awful callous smile, and Josephine followed, just as she had that last time, when Constantia pushed Benny into the round pond. 7. But the strain told on them when they were back in the dining room. They sat down very shaky and looked at each other. "I don't feel I can settle to anything," said Josephine, "until I've had something. Do you think we could ask Kate for 2 cups of hot water?" "I really don't see why we shouldn't," said Constantia carefully. She was quite normal again. I won't ring. I'll go to the kitchen door and ask her." "Yes, do," said Josephine, sinking down into a chair. "Tell her, just 2 cups, Con, nothing else, on a tray." "She needn't even put the jug on, need she?" said Constantia, as though Kate might very well complain if the jug had been there. "Oh, no, certainly not. The jug's not at all necessary. She can pour it direct out of the kettle," cried Josephine, feeling that would be a labour saving indeed. Their cold lips quivered at the greenish brims. Josephine curved her small red hands round the cup. Constantia sat up and blew on the wavy steam, making it flutter from one side to the other. "Speaking of Benny," said Josephine, and though Benny hadn't been mentioned, Constantia immediately looked as though he had. "He'll expect us to send him something of father's, of course, but it's so difficult to know what to send to Ceylon." "You mean things get unstuck so on the voyage?" murmured Constantia. "No, lost," said Josephine sharply. "You know there's no post, only runners." Both paused to watch a black man in white linen drawers running through the pale fields for dear life with a large brown paper parcel in his hands. Josephine's black man was tiny. He scurried along, glistening like an ant. But there was something blind and tireless about Constantia's tall, thin fellow, which made him, she decided, a very unpleasant person indeed. On the veranda, dressed all in white and wearing a cork helmet, stood Benny. His right hand shook up and down as father's did when he was impatient, and behind him, not in the least interested, sat Hilda, the unknown sister-in-law. She swung in a cane rocker and flicked over the leaves of the Tatler. "I think his watch would be the most suitable present," said Josephine. Constantia looked up. She seemed surprised. "Oh, would you trust a gold watch to a native?" "But of course I'd disguise it," said Josephine. "No one would know it was a watch." She liked the idea of having to make a parcel such a curious shape that no one could possibly guess what it was. She even thought for a moment of hiding the watch in a narrow cardboard corset box that she kept by her for a long time, waiting for it to come in for something. It was such beautiful firm cardboard. But no, it wouldn't be appropriate for this occasion. It had lettering on it: medium, women's, 28, extra firm busks. It would be almost too much of a surprise for Benny to open that and find father's watch inside. "And of course, it isn't as though it would be ticking, said Constantia, who was still thinking of the native love of jewellery. "At least," she added, "it would be very strange if after all that time it was." 8. Josephine made no reply. She had flown off on one of her tangents. She'd suddenly thought of Cyril. Wasn't it more usual for the only grandson to have a watch? And then dear Cyril was so appreciative, and a gold watch meant so much to a young man. Benny, in all probability, had quite got out of the habit of watches. Men so seldom wore waistcoats in those hot climates, whereas Cyril in London wore them from year's end to year's end. And it would be so nice for her and Constantia when he came to tea to know it was there. "I see you've got on grandfather's watch, Cyril." It would somehow be so satisfactory. Dear boy. What a blow his sweet, sympathetic little note had been. Of course they quite understood, but it was most unfortunate. It would have been such a point having him, said Josephine, and he would have enjoyed it so, said Constantia, not thinking what she was saying. However, as soon as he got back, he was coming to tea with his aunties. Cyril to tea was one of their rare treats. "Now, Cyril, you mustn't be frightened of our cakes. Your Auntie Con and I bought them at Buzzards this morning. We know what a man's appetite is, so don't be ashamed of making a good tea." Josephine cut recklessly into the rich, dark cake that stood for her winter gloves or the soling and heeling of Constantia's only respectable shoes. But Cyril was most unmanlike in appetite. "I say, Aunt Josephine, I simply can't. I've only just had lunch, you know." "Oh, Cyril, that can't be true. It's after 4, cried Josephine. Constantia sat with her knife poised over the chocolate roll. "It is, all the same," said Cyril. "I had to meet a man at Victoria, and he kept me hanging around till there was only time to get lunch and to come on here. And he gave me, phew," Cyril put his hand to his forehead, "a terrific blowout," he said. It was disappointing today of all days, but still he couldn't be expected to know. "But you'll have a meringue, won't you, Cyril?" said Aunt Josephine. "These meringues were bought specially for you. Your dear father was so fond of them. We were sure you are too." "I am, Aunt Josephine," cried Cyril ardently. "Do you mind if I take half to begin with?" "Not at all, dear boy, but we mustn't let you off with that." "Is your dear father still so fond of meringues?" asked Auntie Con gently. She winced faintly as she broke through the shell of hers. "Well, I don't quite know, Auntie Con," said Cyril breezily. At that, they both looked up. "Don't know?" almost snapped Josephine. "Don't know a thing like that about your own father, Cyril?" "Surely," said Aunt Con softly. Cyril tried to laugh it off. "Oh, well," he said, "it's such a long time since—" He faltered. He stopped. Their faces were too much for him. "Even so," said Josephine. And Auntie Con looked. Cyril put down his teacup. "Wait a bit," he cried. "Wait a bit, Aunt Josephine. What am I thinking of?" He looked up. They were beginning to brighten. Cyril slapped his knee. "Of course," he said, "it was meringues. How could I have forgotten? Yes, Aunt Josephine, you're perfectly right. Father's most frightfully keen on meringues." They didn't only beam. Aunt Josephine went scarlet with pleasure. Auntie Con gave a deep, deep sigh. "And now, Cyril, you must come and see Father," said Josephine. "He knows you were coming today." "Right," said Cyril, very firmly and heartily. He got up from his chair. Suddenly he glanced at the clock. "I say, Auntie Con, isn't your clock a bit slow? I've got to meet a man at Paddington just after 5. I'm afraid I shan't be able to stay very long with Grandfather." "Oh, he won't expect you to stay very long," said Aunt Josephine. Constantia was still gazing at the clock. She couldn't make up her mind if it was fast or slow. It was one or the other. She felt almost certain of that. At any rate, it had been. Cyril still lingered. "Aren't you coming along, Auntie Con?" "Of course," said Josephine. "We shall all go. Come on, Con." 9. They knocked at the door, and Cyril followed his aunts into Grandfather's hot, sweetish room. "Come on," said Grandfather Pinner. "Don't hang about. What is it? What have you been up to?" He was sitting in front of a roaring fire, clasping his stick. He had a thick rug over his knees. On his lap there lay a beautiful pale yellow silk handkerchief. "It's Cyril, Father," said Josephine shyly, and she took Cyril's hand and led him forward. "Good afternoon, Grandfather," said Cyril, trying to take his hand out of Aunt Josephine's. Grandfather Pinner shot his eye at Cyril in the way he was famous for. Where was Auntie Con? She stood on the other side of Aunt Josephine. Her long arms hung down in front of her. Her arms were clasped. She never took her eyes off Grandfather. "Well," said Grandfather Pinner, beginning to thump, "what have you got to tell me?" What had he got to tell him? Cyril felt himself smiling like a perfect imbecile. The room was stifling too. But Aunt Josephine came to his rescue. She cried brightly, "Cyril says his father's still very fond of meringues, Father dear." "Eh?" said Grandfather Pinner, curving his hand like a purple meringue shell over one ear. Josephine repeated, "Cyril says his father is still very fond of meringues." "Can't hear," said old Colonel Pillar, and he waved Josephine away with his stick, then pointed with his stick to Cyril. "Tell me what she's trying to say," he said. "My God, must I?" said Cyril, blushing and staring at Aunt Josephine. "Do, dear," she smiled. "It will please him so much." "Come on, out with it!" cried Colonel Pinner testily, beginning to thump again. and Cyril leaned forward and yelled, "Father's still very fond of meringues." At that, Grandfather Pinner jumped as though he'd been shot. "Don't shout," he cried. "What's the matter with the boy? Meringues! What about them?" "Oh, Aunt Josephine, must we go on?" groaned Cyril desperately. "It's quite all right, dear boy," said Aunt Josephine, as though he and she were at the dentist's together. "He'll understand in a minute." And she whispered to Cyril, "He's getting a bit deaf, you know." Then she leaned forward and really bawled at Grandfather Pinner. "Cyril only wanted to tell you, Father dear, that his father is still very fond of meringues." Colonel Pinner heard, and brooded, looking Cyril up and down. "What an extraordinary thing," said old Grandfather Pinner. "What an extraordinary thing to come all this way here to tell me." And Cyril felt it was. "Yes, I shall send Cyril the watch," said Josephine. "That will be very nice," said Constantia. "I seem to remember last time he came there was some little trouble about the time." 10. They were interrupted by Kate bursting through the door in her usual fashion, as though she discovered some secret panel in the wall. "Fried or boiled?" asked the bold voice. Fried or boiled? Josephine and Constantia were quite bewildered for a moment. They could hardly take it in. "Fried or boiled what, Kate?" asked Josephine, trying to begin to concentrate. Kate gave a loud sniff. "Fish." "Well, why didn't you say so immediately?" Josephine reproached her gently. "How could you expect us to understand, Kate? There are a great many things in this world, you know, which are fried or boiled." And after such a display of courage, she said quite brightly to Constantia, "Which do you prefer, Con?" "I think it might be nice to have it fried," said Constantia. "On the other hand, of course, boiled fish is very nice. I think I prefer both equally well, unless you, in that case." "I shall fry it," said Kate, and she bounced back, leaving their door open and slamming the door of her kitchen. Josephine gazed at Constantia. She raised her pale eyebrows until they rippled away into her pale hair. She got up. She said in a very lofty, imposing way, "Do you mind following me into the drawing-room, Constantia? I've something of great importance to discuss with you." For it was always to the drawing-room they retired when they wanted to talk over Kate. Josephine closed the door meaningly. "Sit down, Constantia," she said, still very grand. She might have been receiving Constantia for the first time, and Con looked round vaguely for a chair, as though she felt indeed quite a stranger. "Now, the question is," said Josephine, bending forward, "whether we shall keep her or not." "That is the question," agreed Constantia. "And this time," said Josephine firmly, "we must come to a definite decision." Constantia looked for a moment as though she might begin going over all the other times, but she pulled herself together and said, "Yes, Jug." "You see, Con," explained Josephine, "everything is so changed now." Constantia looked up quickly. "I mean," went on Josephine, "we're not dependent on Kate as we were," and she blushed faintly. "There's not Father to cook for." "That is perfectly true," agreed Constantia. "Father certainly doesn't want any cooking now, whatever else." Josephine broke in sharply. "You're not sleepy, are you, Con?" "Sleepy, Chuck?" Constantia was wide-eyed. "Well, concentrate more," said Josephine sharply, and she returned to the subject. "What it comes to is, if we did," and this she barely breathed, glancing at the door, "give Kate notice," she raised her voice again, "we could manage our own food." "Why not?" cried Constantia. She couldn't help smiling. The idea was so exciting. She clasped her hands. "What should we live on, Jug?" "Oh, eggs, in various forms," said Jug lofty again. "And besides, there are all the cooked foods." "But I've always heard," said Constantia, "they are considered so very expensive." "Not if one buys them in moderation," said Josephine. But she tore herself away from this fascinating bypath and dragged Constantia after her. "What we've got to decide now, however, is whether we really do trust Kate or not." Constantia leaned back. A flat little laugh flew from her lips. "Isn't it curious, Jug," said she, "that just on this one subject I've never been able to quite make up my mind." 11. She never had. The whole difficulty was to prove anything. How did one prove things? How could one? Suppose Kate had stood in front of her and deliberately made a face. Mightn't she very well have been in pain? Wasn't it impossible at any rate to ask Kate if she was making a face at her? If Kate answered no, and of course she would say no, what a position! How undignified! Then again, Constantia suspected, she was almost certain that Kate went to her chest of drawers when she and Josephine were out, not to take things, but to spy. Many times she'd come back to find her amethyst cross in the most unlikely places, under her lace ties or on top of her evening Bertha. More than once, she laid a trap for Kate. She had arranged things in a special order and then called Josephine to witness. You see, Jug? Quite con. Now we shall be able to tell. But oh dear, when she did go to look, she was as far off from the proof as ever. If anything was displaced, it might so very well have happened as she closed the drawer. A jolt might have done it so easily. You come, Jug, and decide. I really can't. It's quite difficult. But after a pause and a long glare, Josephine would sigh. Now you've put the doubt into my mind, Con. I'm sure I can't tell myself. Well, we can't postpone it again, said Josephine. If we postpone it this time. 12. But at that moment in the street below, a barrel organ struck up. Josephine and Constantia sprang to their feet together. Run, Con, said Josephine. Run quickly. There's sixpence on the... Then they remembered. It didn't matter. They would never have to stop the organ grinder again. Never again would she and Constantia be told to make that monkey take his noise somewhere else. Never would sound that loud, strained bellow when father thought they were not hurrying enough. The organ grinder might play there all day, and the stick would not thump. It will never thump again. It will never thump again, played the barrel organ. What was Constantia thinking? She had such a strange smile. She looked different. She couldn't be going to cry. Jug, Jug, said Constantia softly, pressing her hands together. Do you know what day it is? It's Saturday. It's a week today. A whole week. A week since father died. A week since father died, cried the barrel organ. And Josephine too forgot to be practical and sensible. She smiled faintly, strangely. On the Indian carpet there fell a square of sunlight, pale red. It came and went, and came and stayed, deepened until it shone almost golden. The sun's out, said Josephine, as though it really mattered. A perfect fountain of bubbling notes shook from the barrel organ, round, bright notes carelessly scattered. Constantia lifted her big cold hands as if to catch them, and then her hands fell again. She walked over to the mantelpiece to her favourite Buddha, and the stone and gilt image whose smile always gave her such a queer feeling, almost a pain, and yet a pleasant pain, seemed today to be more than smiling. He knew something. He had a secret. I know something you don't know, said her Buddha. Oh, what was it? What could it be? And yet she had always felt there was something. The sunlight pressed through the windows, thieved its way in, flashed its light over the furniture and the photographs. Josephine watched it. When it came to Mother's photograph, the enlargement of the piano, it lingered, as though puzzled to find so little remained of Mother, except the earrings shaped like tiny pagodas and a black feather boa. Why did the photographs of dead people always fade so? Wondered Josephine. As soon as a person was dead, their photograph died too. But of course, this one of Mother was very old. It was 35 years old. Josephine remembered standing on a chair and pointing out that feather boa to Constantia and telling her that it was a snake that had killed their mother in Ceylon. Would everything have been different if Mother hadn't died? She didn't see why. Aunt Florence had lived with them until they had left school, and they had moved 3 times and had their yearly holiday, and there'd been changes of servants, of course. Some little sparrows, young sparrows they sounded, chirped on the window ledge. Eep, eep, eep. But Josephine felt that they were not sparrows, not on the window ledge. It was inside her, that queer little crying noise. Eep, eep, eep. And what was it crying, so weak and forlorn? If Mother had lived, might they have married? But there had been nobody for them to marry. There had been Father's Anglo-Indian friends before he quarrelled with them. But after that, she and Constantia never met a single man except clergymen. How did one meet men? Or even if they'd met them, how could they have got to know men well enough to be more than strangers? One read of people having adventures, being followed and so on, but nobody had ever followed Constantia and her. Oh yes, there had been that one year at Eastbourne, a mysterious man at their boarding house who put a note on the jug of hot water inside their bedroom door. But by the time Connie had found it, the steam had made the writing too faint to read. They couldn't even make out to which of them it was addressed. And he'd left the next day. And that was all. The rest had been looking after Father and at the same time keeping out of Father's way. But now... The thieving sun touched Josephine gently. She lifted her face. She was drawn over to the window by gentle beams. Until the barrel organ stopped playing, Constantia stayed before the Buddha, wondering, but not as usual, not vaguely. This time her wonder was like longing. She remembered the time she had come in here, crept out of bed in her nightgown when the moon was full, and lain on the floor with her arms outstretched, as though she were crucified. Why? The big pale moon had made her do it. The horrible dancing figures on the carved screen had leered at her, and she hadn't minded. She remembered too how, whenever they were at the seaside, she had gone off by herself and got as close to the sea as she could and sung something she'd made up, while she gazed all over that restless water. There had been this other life, running out, bringing things home in bags, getting things on approval, discussing them with Jug, and taking them back to get more things on approval, and arranging Father's trays and trying not to annoy Father. But it all seemed to have happened in a kind of tunnel. It wasn't real. It was only when she came out of the tunnel into the moonlight, or by the sea, or into a thunderstorm, that she really felt herself. What did it mean? What was it she was always wanting? What did it all lead to? Now. She turned away from the Buddha with one of her vague gestures. She went over to where Josephine was standing. She wanted to say something to Josephine, something frightfully important, about the future and what... "Don't you think perhaps..." she began. Josephine interrupted her. "I was wondering if now..." she murmured. They stopped. They waited for each other. "Go on, Con," said Josephine. No, Jug, after you," said Constantia. "No, say what you're going to say. You began," said Josephine. I'd rather hear what you were going to say first," said Constantia. "Don't be absurd, Con." "Really, Jug? Connie! Oh, Jug!" A pause. Then Constantia said faintly, "I can't say what I was going to say, Jug, because I've forgotten what it was that I was going to say." Josephine was silent for a moment. She stared at a big cloud where the sun had been. Then she replied shortly, "I've forgotten too." So that was The Daughters of the Late Colonel by Catherine Mansfield, and it wasn't your strictly classic ghost story, although it's often anthologized in stories, ghost story anthologies, yeah? Because, in a sense, they are haunted by the ghost of their father. Now, I know, at one point I did The Dead by James Joyce, which this story is contemporary with, in a sense. Although The Dead was 1914, this is 1922, but and they're both modernist works. I'm going to maybe say something about modernism, but this is 10 years later, 8 years later, and by the time this came around, Joyce was writing more overtly modernist stuff, Ulysses and later on Finnegan's Wake. But I'm not here to talk about James Joyce. I'm here to talk about Catherine Mansfield, who was born in 1888 and in New Zealand, in Wellington, New Zealand. And she is a very, very well regarded author. As I said, it's not a strictly... my point about mentioning the dead, because I got sidetracked thinking about the dates, was people had complained that that's not a ghost story. Well, in a sense it is. I mean, they're haunted by the ghost of Michael Fury. That's a spoiler. In this story is very much about the dead father. At one point they have the bizarre ghostly apparition of their father living in his possessions, and they talk about their mother, the photograph of their mother, and how the photograph dies when a person dies. But in a sense, although she says that, well, Mansfield says that, later they worried that they're at least enough to be scared of it, that their father may be in the wardrobe, or he may be in his sock drawer, which is really actually quite frightening if you think about it. It's that bizarre, frightening thing. Just imagine if the ghost of a loved one is in, because it's a funny thing, isn't it? Although these people loved us, and the return of the ancestors is in some ways uncanny and not totally comfortable. We loved them, but we don't necessarily want them coming back. So she was a modernist writer, born in 1888 in New Zealand. This story, The Daughters of the Late Colonel, was part of her short story collection, The Garden Party and Other Stories. And I have the classic literature channel, which I do occasionally, and I've done The Garden Party, a fantastic story such as this. This is a fantastic story in my opinion. So they were published in that collection in 1922. It is, let's say more about her first. She was a modernist, we said that, regarded as a feminist writer. Her childhood was marked by a sense of rootlessness, as her family frequently moved between New Zealand and England. This story, is it in New Zealand? Is it in England? Is it in England? I mean, it probably could be both. Culturally, in the Edwardian period, were both part of an extended British Empire. So she spent much of her adult life in Europe, particularly in England and France, where she was very literary and got involved with the literary scenes. Her first published works appeared in the avant-garde literary magazine Rhythm in 1911, and her first collection of short stories called In a German Pension was published in 1911. But her later collections, Bliss and Other Stories 1920, and The Garden Party and Other Stories from this stories come from, established her reputation as a master or a mistress of the short story form. So they are known for their subtlety, the precision of language, and their ability to conjure the nuances of human emotion and experience. I think that is exactly what we've got there. So that's the first thing, what she can do. It's like watching a very talented watercolourist. She can convey, with the strokes of her language, very subtle nuances of, and we're feeling with them, we're feeling their indecision, we're feeling their embarrassment, we're feeling their anger, and of course all of these things are subdued. They don't experience any of them very strongly. They're all sat upon, and she is so good that she can convey this sense of not only that the emotions are present, but they are repressed, I suppose we'd say. So, and her technique is the stream of consciousness. So, of course, Virginia Woolf, a contemporary, another modernist writer, would write famously Mrs. Dalloway and other stream of consciousness. So, previous to this, and this seems to us fairly ordinary now, but in those days, before that, it was always done from not always, but mostly done from an objective, external viewpoint. I'm stressing it a bit, but because Tristram Shandy, of course, is written. Is in first person, but giving that, the modernists deliberately drew little distinction between the world as it is experienced. We tend to think of the internal, the external, my personal thoughts, my personal feelings, external expressions, what other people look like, so we divide the world. But for the modernists, they played around with this and it all came out as one thing. And of course it's no secret that phenomenology with Edmund Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, I'm mixing my dates up now, I'd have to go and do exact chronology, but this, in Europe, this feeling of that we are not apart from the world, but it's part of our experience, and the only world we have is the phenomena that we experience, And I think modernism, through, think of James Joyce, particularly Ulysses, and the almost unreadable, I've never been able to read it, Finnegan's Wake, and Mrs. Dalloway, and this story, what we're getting is and T.S. Eliot's poetry, etc., loads of modernists, what we're getting is the phenomenological world that they inhabit, where things aren't. So, for example, what I mean is, she's sitting there and she's a bit, I think it's Con, who's a bit perturbed by the nurse who wants the butter, and she looks and sees the imaginary camels, and then later on they imagine delivering the parcel that's some kind of disguised so the natives won't steal it, and they imagine the dark-skinned man running with the parcel, and they imagined this woman they've never met reading the Tatler. And of course this is exactly how our minds work. You may have an Uncle John who you've never met, lives in Buenos Aires, and but you've got an imagination of him, and you may even people that imagination with his wife who you've never met, who's reading the Tatler, for example. So I think this is very modernist, but it is well done as well. And yeah, going back to her life, so she manages to do, she was born in 1888, she didn't live a long time. She was diagnosed with tuberculosis in 1917, and she went to various sanatoria across Europe. It reminds me of the Magic Mountain, Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain. This was the thing that people did, because they couldn't cure tuberculosis, and we should be really glad to medical science that it can now, and prevent it as well. And so, but it was futile, and she died at the age of only 34, reading a relatively small but enormously influential body of work. So I really am very impressed by Catherine Mansfield's skill at painting pictures, and I often talk, mockingly, and I'm not always serious in what I say. I don't know if you picked that up yet, but about how literature. So we have classic fiction, which all descends really from the Gothic novel. Not classic fiction, genre fiction, whether it be our adventure stories, our spy stories, our detective stories, our horror stories, they all come from Gothic fiction. And we have another stream of literature which is more realist, which develops into literary fiction. And in literary fiction, I'll often say, you have a short volume about some man who sits in a cafe in France and it's raining, and nothing much happens, but we treat it to a parade of these melancholy and ultimately the directionless thoughts, and that's it at its worst, I think. But here, the gift that she has is we're cringing with her, I think. You might, if you read about this, it's a if you read the critics, and if you're going to do an essay on it for school, it's about patriarchal oppression. But I think, and I really do think this, and whereas that isn't to, this is a real experience of women in the Victorian Edwardian period, that they were accessories to the men in their lives, so they belonged to their fathers, they belonged to their husbands, and they were legally unable to do many things to be free in their own right. That's absolutely true. But what I want to say is, if we just nail it up to the mast of this is patriarchal obsession, we lose the subtlety, we lose the nuance, we lose the gift that she's given us, particularly of the two daughters, of portraying really believable and cringeworthy, in that we cringe for them, we feel for their wasted lives. They've spent their mother died, and they ponder what might have happened if their mother had lived. But their mother died, and they spent the rest of their time. And the only man I would say who is one-dimensional is the Colonel, the late Colonel. He's just this angry Colonel blimp dude with one eye who bangs his cane, who's deaf, who maybe isn't completely two-dimensional, three-dimensional. Will I give him 3 dimensions? Oh, well, I give him 4. Let's not get into string theory here. But so he is, and the visitors that come in, the clergyman and Cyril and Benny, the brother, who has escaped because he's a man and he's allowed to escape and go off to Ceylon, and exploit the natives of Ceylon, as was the habit in those days. I'm not justifying it, okay. And so, if we just make it about the patriarchy, and I'm not saying it isn't, but if we just make it that, we just do it as a cartoon. And I think it's a disservice to her to do it as a cartoon. So we could just see them all as ciphers. And I think, as I said, the Colonel lends himself to this, stereotypical angry Colonel figure, domineering, coercive. He is all those things, we lose the subtlety of the two daughters, the two sisters, and their interaction, I think, is delicious. The way I just really love the way they are with each other as well. But they vacillate. They can't make a decision to save their lives, and you can argue that this agency is being robbed from them, stolen from them. She talks about the thieving light, doesn't she? By the patriarchy, say that, by Victorian Edwardian society, in the English-speaking, or not even the English-speaking, but the British Empire, if you like. And I'm not saying this is probably true also for France, Germany, Portugal. But we lose their subtlety, and one of the things that occurs to me that we're playing with here is about free will and destiny, and are there weak, vacillating, but very sweet natures a product of their domineering father and the death of their mother? Are they basically creatures produced by their environment totally? Or do they have any agency? Do they have any free will at all? And in which case, is their vacillating weakness? I mean, they can't stand up to this must have been, for her class of person, a recurring problem. And I think if you read literature from this period, it does occur again and again, that the gentry, who are ever so nice, the nice gentry, struggle to stand up to their bossy servants. We talk about first world problems. I mean, that is their first world problem, not one that we have particularly now. I don't know, you might have trouble with your maid. I don't have a maid. So the point is, I said this before, is their fate due to their internal weakness? They are just that way. They could choose to be something else. Or is it due to their conditioning? Now, if we say it's due to their conditioning, then we must accept that all women under that system were weak, vacillating creatures, and that's clearly untrue. I think of the women in my life, which, we're talking about the 20th century, namely 20th, 21st century. I've been surrounded by really strong women, characters, all. My grandmother and my great-grandmother, who I remember as a very little boy, immensely strong, tough women. I mean, my grandmother ruled the roost completely. My mother, very strong personality. I have two daughters, and one is particularly a strong person. And I kind of acquiesce in many ways to all of them. And Sheila, my partner, a very strong character. So and maybe no accident I've surrounded myself with. Is it fate? Whatever. But there we are. So what I'm saying is, if we say, oh yeah, all women were oppressed in the same way, and so this is what we got, I think that's a disservice both to these ladies, these two young, well, they're not young anymore, these two women. Anyway, I've made the point. I think the easy strategy is to go for stereotypes. We have people with black hats, we have people with white hats, and especially if we play with this, which is a big feature of 20th century, 21st century thinking. Everybody is either an oppressor or the oppressed. So I'm not actually, don't count as very oppressed. But I mean, if we fall into certain categories, say if you're a woman, say if your sexuality or your gender is non-normative, say you're atypical, say you're of a different race, say you're from a different culture, say your religion's different. We can look and we can go, yes, I am the product of my identities. If you add up all these factors of me, that's what you get. But I think if we do that and we say I'm merely a product of the categories I fit into, we lose something of the humanity, which I think Catherine Mansfield conveys pretty brilliantly here. I also wanted to say something I said about modernism. We talked about a technique of stream of consciousness. This is a whole lecture in itself. I want to talk about coercion and control a little bit, in that, clearly that's what's going on. The father coerces and controls. We talk about, whether do they allow themselves, and I think it's a bit more complex than that. And I think people who are in relationships, and statistically probably will be women, but it's not completely women, who are coerced by their loved ones. I mean, I've seen older adults be. I remember I was on a ward once, and I'm ambivalent about assisted dying, because if the decision is in the hands of the so-called loved ones, I've seen many cases where the loved ones want that person dead. And have said as much, they want them dead. And I remember one particular time we had a guy who had an old fella, and he had on one of the wards, and he had pneumonia, and he was about to pass away. And I think that one of the doctors had thought him dead, or had said, look, prepare yourself for the worst. So the family sold all his furniture. Then he rallied and got better. They've sold all the guy's furniture. Coercion can come in many forms, but it does exist within familial relationships a lot. And the ambivalence of this, I want to say something more about ambivalence, is we can both hate but depend upon a difficult situation. So if you think about prison, I've worked with many ex-prisoners who come into the real world, the everyday world, and they're at a loss. They're very anxious, because prison gives them structure. They know who they are, they know where they've got to go, they know who everybody is, whereas in the real world it's free form. And I think in a sense part of the two, Con and Jug, their anxiety here is because of that. The monstrous father, monstrous as he was, provided an anchor and stability, and now this is removed. They're presented with this awful, and this is like, let's think about existentialism. This is Sartre, Camus, at the same time that this story was written, existentialism is coming out and saying we are condemned. Who is it? We are condemned to be free. Is that Sartre? That could have been Camus, I can't remember. But this whole thing about, here you are in the universe, now make your choices. You're doomed to be free. So once the father is dead, they are doomed to be free, and they struggle with it. And you could argue it's early days, and fair enough, and let's hope that things get better for them. But at the end, she ends the story so magnificently, I think, in that they're both about to make plans for the future. And when you read some of the notes I've been reading about the analyses of this story, they forget about. I don't think they do forget about it. I mean, we could argue psychoanalytically they repress the thought and it goes away, and they actually do forget about it. But I think it's actually more powerful, my feelings, if they just bite on their tongues and they don't speak, because freedom is too scary. And that's, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein. So Melanie Klein was an Austrian, died in Britain, was really fundamental to, because in Britain, Freudian psychoanalysis, Freud came to Britain to escape the Nazis, and his daughter Anna Freud and Melanie Klein and people like this, they constructed a whole new structure of psychoanalysis called object relations, whereas Freud was very much about sexuality. I think the object relations is about you have relations with people who you then introject, as they call it, and you create a model, a fantasy figure of that person inside you. And actually your relations is not really primarily with the person. You spend a lot of your time with the object. And I think what's happening in this story is their father has been internalized as this object, as this Kleinian object, introjected, and their fear of the father, the father is still alive for them in the story, isn't it? They worry that he's going to rebuke them still, even though he's dead, because the father they always dealt with is an internal figure, is an internal object. The other thing about Klein, Melanie Klein is really, really interesting, and I found her hard to understand. And she has the paranoid schizoid position, lots of stuff like this. It's very technical. But what she says about the child typically interjects the parent most often, well, both the parents, has the primary relationship usually with the mother, but of course in this case the mother's dead, which is interesting, and is with the father. So the primary object they're dealing with is with the father. Now, with the nurturing object, the nurturer, the father, even if he's a bad nurturer, which he is emotionally, he's kept them alive. He's fed them in a mean-fisted way. He's put a roof over their head, exactly, not extravagantly, but he has enabled their survival, if not their flourishing. And he hasn't enabled their flourishing at all. I mean, he has had his relations with them as well. He has needed them. I was going to say, let me finish this, and if I remember, I'll come back to the other one. So Kleinian theory is that we have this internal object who we hate and we love at the same time. We flip between the two. This is the schizoid in the sense of splitting. So, the child loves its mother, but hates its mother. When the mother doesn't give it what it wants, it flips between the two. And it imagines dreadful revenge on the mother. It wants to kill the hated mother object. But it also is terrified of two things, particularly with the father, that the father will, if they attempt to kill the hated father, the father will destroy them in revenge. And then, of course, so that's if they fail to kill the father. I'm talking about the object, the internal object, but it's a fantasy process. So, but if they succeed in killing the father or the mother, then who will nourish them? And I think this is a massively Kleinian story, which is why I bring it up. The other thing I wanted to say, I'm probably going to... so Melanie Klein, great. Catherine Mansfield, great. I've got to go to the gym, apparently. And the other woman I want to reference in this is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a Swiss doctor who specialised in working with the dying, and it was her that came up with the stages of grief. She later wrote a book about her experiences with the dead who come back, or the survival, and so for the first book, which was all about which is still used, the stages of grief, she was given immense plaudits, and then as soon as she started talking about, do you know what, her experience of working with the dead convinced her that death is not the end, and then the scientific community were like, yeah, thanks Elizabeth, shut up now, but I've got both the books. Anyway, one of the first stages that Kubler-Ross talks about is the denial. So we deny it kind of happened, and if you've lost someone, and I think what Mansfield does really, really well is, of course, she wrote this before Kubler-Ross wrote her stages of grief, yeah? I think Kubler-Ross was the 50s, somebody will correct me if I'm wrong. So I'm not saying that she was referencing Kubler-Ross, I was saying that Kubler-Ross correctly pictured the stages, and Catherine Mansfield anticipated them, at least the first one. So it's like they can't believe their dad's dead. They're still waiting they still go to shut up the barrel organ player. They're still waiting the thump. They're still awaiting the rebuke. They can't get used to, it's almost like a denial, isn't it? And we've all been through that if we've lost somebody. That's the first thing I want to say at that stage. And the other thing I wanted to compliment Catherine Mansfield on even further is that she conveys that feeling that we have in the immediate death of a parent or a loved one. I've never been unfortunate enough to lose a younger person or a partner, and I'm touching wood here, but that unreal weirdness when people come round and things are different, and it's just so odd, and I think she does that very well. I was going to say, one of the issues, this is again, sometimes these things are sensitive. So obviously in my career before I retired, I worked with a lot of people who had mental illness, and majority of them were the so-called common mental illnesses. That doesn't mean that they're not debilitating, such as anxiety, OCD, and depression. And depression is very hard to cure. And in many cases, we had a lot of people who were at the very bottom of the social scale, so they were extremely deprived financially, materially, because they didn't work, and so they had no money, and they lived hand to mouth, really. And but the welfare state, I'm not knocking it, it's a great thing. I'm just reading a book about Harold Wilson, so I'm all for it. I am all for it, so that can may upset other people as well, but I am. But these particular patients of ours, they would come time and time again, and nothing seemed to make them any better. None of the medication gave them, none of the therapy made them any better. And the issue was, and this is in context of talking about the prisoner who finds the prisoner horrifically structuring, and like being in a coercive relationship where it's horrible, but at the same time it's less scary than freedom. And with the welfare state, what happened was that these patients would get money from the state because they were ill. They would get housing benefit. It wasn't a lot of money, and they were poor. But I used to say to my students, if we cure this person, they've got to get a job. They've got to pay rent. They've got to potentially buy a car, potentially go to work, turn up, learn things, have demands put on them. So, it'd be like you curing me and me being out of work. As soon as I cure this person, it's like me losing my job. I lose everything. And so you can see why they become prisoners within the coercion of depression, if you like, that coercive structure of depression, if you like that. So that's why it's impossible to, really difficult. But at the same time, I want to end on a positive note and say that I also witnessed people coming out of that and really taking on the world. And I was often amazed when I came across people who'd had such adversity and had managed to shine. So that neatly ties into that theme of, are we victims of our circumstances, or are we the products of our character? Yeah, and these aren't comfortable questions, but literature exists to make us think about them. And I think, it's great to be entertained, but the purpose of art is to communicate things about the human condition. So that's me sticking up for literary fiction now. Yeah, and also, just to name check again, in case you think I'm an agent of the patriarchy, Catherine Mansfield, wonderful. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, groundbreaking. Melanie Klein, stupendously intelligent and profound in how she helped us understand the workings of the psyche. So 3 fantastic women I've referenced here. I'm not an agent of the patriarchy, man. But I also stick up for men as well. So somebody once called me a traitor to men, and I'm not, because men have particular struggles which we won't talk about here. But what I think is, why can't we all just get along? Wouldn't that be nice? Welcome to this week's reading on the Classic Ghost Stories podcast. The Haunted Spinney by Elliot O'Donnell was first published in 1904. Now, O'Donnell was an author who often blurred the lines between ghost story and alleged fact. This tale unfolds in a foreboding woodland, following a man's bizarre discovery and its haunting aftermath. What subtle ghosts lurk hidden beneath the twisted trees? This is a story where truth and imagination, madness and hauntings are not easily disentangled. So join me, Tony Walker, narrator of the Classic Ghost Stories podcast, for this week's story.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody dies. Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back? What's the secret?
The Haunted Spinney by Elliot O'Donnell, published in 1905. It was a cold night. Rain had been falling steadily, not only for hours but days. The ground was saturated. As I walked along the country lane, The slush splashed over my boots and trousers. To my left was a huge stone wall, behind which I could see the nodding heads of firs, and through them the wind was rushing, making a curious whistling sound, now loud, now soft, roaring and gently murmuring. The sound fascinated me. I fancied it might be the angry voice of a man and the plaintive pleading of a woman, and then a weird chorus of unearthly beings, of grotesque things that stalked along the Cornish moors and crept from behind huge boulders. Nothing but the wind was to be heard. I stood and listened to it. I could have listened for hours, for I felt in harmony with my surroundings. Lonely. The moon showed itself at intervals from behind the scudding clouds and lighted up the open landscape to my left. A gaunt hill covered with rocks, some piled up pyramidically, others strewn here and there. A few trees with naked arms tossing about and looking distressfully slim beside the more stalwart boulders. A sloping field or two, a couple of level ones crossed by a tiny path, and the lane where I stood. The scenery was desolate, not actually wild, but sad and forlorn, and the spinney by my side lent an additional weird aspect to the place, which was pleasing to me. Suddenly I heard a sound, a familiar sound enough at other times, but at this hour and in this place, everything seemed different. A woman was coming along the road, a woman in a dark cloak with a basket under her arm, and the wind was blowing her skirts about her legs. I looked at the trees. One singularly gaunt and fantastic one appalled me. It had long, gnarled arms, and two of them ended in bunches of twigs like hands. Yes, they were exactly like hands. Huge, murderous-looking hands, with bony fingers. The moonlight played over and around me. I was bathed in it. I had no business to be on the earth. My proper place was in the moon. I no longer thought it. I knew it. The woman was close at hand. She stopped at a little wicket gate leading into the lane skirting the north walls of the spinney. I felt angry. What right had she to be there, interrupting my musings with the moon? The tree with the human hands appeared to agree with it. I saw anger in the movements of its branches, anger which soon blazed into fury as they gave a mighty bend towards her, as if longing to rend her in pieces. I followed the woman, and the wind howled louder and louder through those rustling leaves. How long I scrambled on, I do not know. As soon as the moonlight left me, I fell into a kind of slumber, a delicious trance, broken by nothing save the murmurings of the wind and the sighing and groaning of the winds, sweeter music I never heard. Then it came a terrible change. The charm of my thoughts was broken. I awoke from my reverie. A terrific roar broke on my ears, and a perfect hurricane of rain swept through the woods. I crept cold and shivering beneath the shelter of the trees. To my surprise, a hand fell on my shoulder. It was a man, and like myself, he shivered. "Who are you?" he whispered in a strangely hoarse voice. "Who are you? Why are you here?" "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," I replied, shaking off his grasp. "Well, tell me, for God's sake, man." He was frightened, trembling with fright. Could it be the storm, or was it those trees? I told him then and there why I had trespassed. I was fascinated. The wind and the trees had led me thither. "So am I," he whispered. "I am fascinated. It is a long word, but it describes my sentiments." What did the wind sound like? I told him. He was a poor common man and had no poetical ideas. The wildly romantic had never interested him. He was but an ignorant labouring man. Sounded like sighing, groaning and so on, he asked, shifting uneasily from one foot to another. It was cold, horribly cold. Was that all? "Yes, of course. Why ask?" I replied. Then I laughed. This stupid, sturdy son of toil had been scared. To him the sounds had been those of his Cornish bogies, things he had dreaded in his infancy. I told him so. He didn't like to hear me make fun of him. He didn't like my laugh, and he persisted. "Was that all you heard?" Then I grew impatient and asked him to explain what he meant. "Well," he said, "I thought I heard a scream, a cry, just as if someone had jumped out on someone else and taken them unawares. Maybe it was the wind. only the wind. But it had an eerie sound. The man was nervous. The storm had frightened away whatever wits he may have possessed. "Come, let's be going," I said, moving away in the direction of the wall. I wanted to find a new exit. I was tired of paths. The man kept close to me. I could hear his teeth chatter. Accidentally, I felt his hand brush against mine. His flesh was icy cold. He gave a cry as if a snake had bitten him. Then the truth flashed through me. The man was mad. His terror, his strange manner of showing it, and now this sudden shrinking from me revealed it all. He was mad. The moon and the trees had done their work. "I'm not going that way," he said. "Come along with me. I want to see which of the trees it was that cried." His voice was changed. He seemed suddenly to have grown stranger. There was no insanity in his tone now, but I knew the cunning of the insane, and I feared to anger him, so I acquiesced. What an idea. One of the trees had cried. Did he mean the wind? He grew sullen when I jeered at him. He led me to a little hollow in the ground, and I noticed the prints of several feet in the wet mud. Then I saw something which sent the cold blood to my heart. A woman bathed in blood lay before me. Somehow she was familiar to me. I looked again, then again. Yes, there was the dark shawl of the basket, broken it was true, with the contents scattered, but it was the same basket. It was the woman I'd seen coming down the road. "My God, whatever is this?" the man by my side spoke. He swayed backwards and forwards on his feet, his face white and awful in the moonlight. He was sick with terror. "Oh God, it's horrible, horrible!" Then, with a sudden earnestness and a crafty look in his eyes, he bent over her. "Who is it?" he cried. "Who is the poor wretch?" I saw him peer into her face, but he didn't touch her. He dreaded the blood. Then he started back, his eyes filled with such savageness as I had never seen in any man's before. He looked a devil. He was a devil. "It's my wife!" he shrieked. "My wife!" His voice fell and turned into what sounded like a sob. "It's Mary! She was coming back to St. Ives. It was her cry. There, see it, confound you. You have it on your arm, your coat. It's all over you." He raised his hand to strike me. The moonlight fell on it, a great coarse hand, and I noticed with a thrill of horror a red splash on it. It was blood. The man was a murderer. He'd killed her, and with all the cunning of the madman, was trying to throw the guilt on me. I sprang at him with a cry of despair. He kicked, hit, and tried to tear my arms from his neck, but somehow I seemed to have 10 times my usual strength. And all the while we struggled, a sea of faces waved to and fro, peering down at us from the gaunt trees above. He gave in at length, and I held him no longer with the iron grip, and help came in the shape of a policeman. The man seemed to grasp the situation easily. There had been a murder. The man whom I had secured was known to him. He was a labouring man of unsteady habits. He had been drinking, had met and quarrelled with his wife. The rest was to be seen in the ghastly heap before us. The wretch had no defence. He seemed dazed, and eyed the bloodstains on his face and clothes in a kind of stupid way. I slipped 5 shillings into the policeman's hand when we parted. He thanked me and pocketed the money. He knew his position and mine too. I was a gentleman, and a very plucky one at that. So I thought as I walked back to my rooms. Yet I lay awake and shuddered as visions of the nodding heads of trees rose before me, and from without, across the silent rows of houses, lanes and fields, there rose and fell again the wailing of a woman in distress. 2. The murder in the spinney was an event in St. Ives. The people were unused to such tragedies, and it afforded them conversation for many weeks. The evidence against the husband was conclusive. He'd been caught red-handed, he was a habitual drunkard, and he paid the penalty for his crime in the usual manner. I left St. Ives. I had seen enough of Cornwall, and thirsted for life in London once more. Yet often, at night, the sighing of the wind in the trees sounded in my ears and bid me visit them once more. One day, as I was sitting by my fire with a pile of magazines by my side, taking life easily, for I had nothing to do but kill time, my old friend Frank Wedmore looked me up. We'd been at Clifton together in the far-off 80s, and he was the only friend of the old set of whom I'd lost sight. He'd not altered so much, in spite of a moustache and a fair sprinkling of white hairs. I should have known him had I met him anywhere. He was wearing a Chesterfield coat, very spruce and smart, and his face was red with healthy exercise. "How are you, old chap?" he exclaimed, shaking hands in the hearty fashion of true friendship. I winced, for he had strong hands. "Oh, fit enough," I said, but a bit bored. "But you look just the same, and fresh as a daisy." I gave him the easy chair. "Oh, I'm first rate. Plenty of work. I'm a journalist, you know, plenty of grind, but I'm taking a bit of a holiday." "You look pale. Your eyes are bad." I told him they got strained if I read much. "I dare say you'll think me mad," he went on, "but I'm going to ask you a rather curious question. I remember you used to be fond of ghosts and all sorts of queer things." I nodded. We had many such discussions in my study at school. "Well, I'm a member of the Psychical Research Society." I smiled doubtfully. "Well, you can't say they've discovered much. The name is high-sounding, but nothing beyond." "Never mind. Someday, perhaps, we shall show the public that at present it is only in the early stages of investigation." Wedmore lit a cigarette, puffed away in silence for a few seconds, and then went on. "I'm undertaking a little work for the Society now." "Where?" "In Cornwall. Ever been there?" I nodded. Wedmore was very much at his ease. "Been to St Ives?" I knew by instinct he would mention the place. He thought I looked ill and told me I'd been overdoing it. "It's merely a case of the flu," I assured him. "I had it 6 weeks ago and still feel the effects." The woman in the hollow was before me. I saw again her shabby shawl and the blood round her throat. "There was a murder down there a short time ago." "I heard of it," I remarked casually. "It was a wife murder, I believe." "Yes, just a common wife murder. And the fellow was caught and hanged." "Then why the ghost?" "Well, that's the odd part of it," Wedmore said slowly, leaning back in his chair, his long legs stretched out. "I've heard from 2 St Ives artists, I beg their pardon, golfists, yet screams have been heard in the spinney about 12 o'clock at night. Not the time for practical jokers, and the Cornish are too superstitious to try their pranks in unsavoury spots. And from what I heard, the spot is singularly uncanny." "They haven't seen anything?" I asked. "No, only heard the cries, and they are so terribly realistic and appalling that no one cares to pass the place at night. Indeed, it's utterly banned. I mentioned the case to old Potters. You may have heard of him. He's the author of When the Veil is Cleared Away, and he pressed me to go down and investigate. I agreed. Then I thought I would look you up. Do you recollect your pet aversion in the way of ghosts?" I nodded. "Yes, and I still have the aversion. I think locality exercises strange influence over some minds. The peaceful meadow scenery holds no lurking horrors in its bosom, but in the lonesome moorlands, full of curiously moulded boulders, grotesque weakness must affect one there. Creatures seem to come odd and ill-defined as their surroundings. As a child, I had a peculiar horror of those tall, odd-shaped boulders with seeming faces, featureless, it's true, but sometimes strangely resembling humans and animals. I believe the spinney may be haunted by something of this nature, terrible as the trees." "You know the spinney?" "I do, and I know the trees." Again in my ears the wind rushed as it had on the night in question. "Will you come with me?" Wedmore eyed me eagerly. The same old affection he had once entertained for me was ripening in his eyes. Indeed, it had always remained there. Should I go? An irresistible impulse seized me, a morbid craving to look once more at the blood-stained hollow, to hear again the wind. I looked out of the window. The sky was cold and grey. There were rows and rows of chimneys everywhere, a sea of chimneys, an ocean of dull, uninviting smoke. I began to hate London and to long for the countless miles of blue sea and the fresh air of the woods. I assented when better judgment would have led me to refuse. "Yes, I will go. As for the ghost, it may be there, but it's not as you think. It's not the apparition of a man. It may be in part like a man, but it's one of those cursed nightmares I've always had. I shall see it, hear it shriek, and if I drop dead from fright, you, old man, will be to blame." Wedmore was an enthusiast. Psychical adventure always allured him, and he would run the risk of my weak heart and have me with him. 1,000 times I prepared to go back on my word. 1,000 tumultuous emotions of some impending disaster rushed through me. I felt on the border of an abyss, dark and hopeless. I was pushed on by invisible and unfriendly hands. I knew I must fall, knew that the black depths in front would engulf me eternally. I took the plunge. We talked over Clifton days and arranged our train to the west. Wedmore looked very boyish, I thought, as he rose to go, and stood smiling his goodbye in the doorway. He was all kindness. I liked him more than ever. I felt my heart go out to him, and yet, somehow, as we stood looking at one another, a grey shadow swept around him, and an icy pang shot through my heart. 3. It was night once more, and the moonlight poured in floods from over the summit of the knoll where the uncanny boulders lay. Every obstacle stood silhouetted against the dark background. A house with its white walls stood grim and silent. The paths running in various directions up and alongside the hill were made doubly clear in the whiteness of the beams that fell on them. There were no swift clouds, nothing to hide the brilliance of the stars, and it was nearly midnight. The air was cold, colder than is usual in St. Ives. The lights of many boats twinkled on the bay, and Godrevy stood out boldly away to the right, looking not more than a mile or so away. There were no lights to be seen in St. Ives itself. The town was absolutely still and dark. Not a voice, not a sound, not even the baying of a dog. It was very ghostly, and I shivered. Wedmore stood by my side. I glanced apprehensively at him. Why did he stand in the moonlight? What business had he there? I laughed, but I fear there was but little mirth in the sound. "I wish you'd stop that infernal noise," he said. "I'm pretty nervous as it is." "All right," I whispered. "I won't do it again." But I did, and he edged sharply away from me. I looked over his head. There was the gaunt tree with the great hands. I fancied the branches were once again fingers. I told him so. "For God's sake, man, keep quiet," he replied. "You're enough to upset anyone's nerves." He pulled out his watch for the 100th time. "It's close on the hour." I again looked at the trees and listened. Suddenly, although there had been absolute silence before, I heard a faint breathing sound, a very gentle murmur. It came from over the distant knoll, very soft and low, but gradually louder and louder, and then, as it rushed past us into the spinney beyond, I saw once more the great trees rock beneath it, and again came those voices, those of the woman and the man. Wedmore looked ill, very ill, I thought. I touched him on the arm. "You're frightened," I said. "You, a member of the Research Society. You afraid?" "Something's going to happen," he gasped. "I felt it. I know it. We shall see the murder. We shall know the secret of death." "What's that?" Away in the distance, the tapping of shoes came through the still night air. Tap, 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 down the path from the knoll. I clutched Wedmore by the arm. "You think you'll see the murder, do you? And the murderer?" Wedmore didn't answer. His breath came in gasps. He looked about him like a man at bay. "And the murderer? Ha! It comes from there! See, it's looking at us from those trees. It's all arms and legs. It has no human face. It will drop to the earth. And then we shall see what happens." Tap, tap, tap. The steps grew louder. Nearer and nearer they came. The great shadows from the trees stole down one by one to meet them. I looked again at Wedmore. He was fearfully expectant. So was I. A woman came tripping along the path. I knew her in an instant. There was the shabby shawl, the basket on her arm. It was the same. She approached the wicket. I looked at Wedmore. He was spellbound with fear. I touched his arm. I dragged him with me. "Come," I whispered. "We shall see which of us is right. You think the ghostly murderer will resemble men. It won't. Come." I dragged him forward. Had it not been for me, he would have fled. But I was firm. We passed through the gate. We followed the figure as it silently glided on. We turned to the left. The place grew very dark as the trees met overhead. I heard the trickling of water and knew we were close to the ditch. I gazed intently at the trees. When would the horror drop from them? A sickly terror laid hold of me. I turned to fly. To my surprise, Wedmore stopped me. He was all excitement. "Wait," he hissed, "wait! It's you who are afraid. Hark! It's 12 o'clock. And as he spoke, the clock of the parish church slowly tolled midnight. Then the end came. An awful scream rang out, so piercing and so full of terror that I felt the blood in my heart stand still. But no figure dropped from the trees. Not from the trees, but from behind the woman. The form darted forward and seized her round the neck. It tore at her throat with its hands. It dragged and hurried her into the moonlight. And then, oh, damning horror, I saw its face. It was my own. The world in general laughed at the strange tale of Francis Wedmore. The madman he had let at midnight gibbering into St. Ives did not convince the sceptical readers of the London dailies with his corroboration. But the St. Ives people knew and understood. It is on account of that the spinney so soon lost its ghosts, though the wind whistles as dismally there as ever.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody dies. Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back? What's the secret of it?
So that was The Haunted Spinney by Elliot O'Donnell. Now, I say in the introduction it was published in 1904, and I believe that to be the case, but I got this copy, I got the story initially before I did my research, in the British Library Tales of the Weird book, Cornish Horrors, Tales from Land's End, edited by Joan Passy. Definitely worth buying that book if you like this kind of thing. But that says the story's from 1905, but when I did my research it turns out that it was published in the November 1904 issue of The Idler, a British monthly magazine known for its humour and light-hearted essays. Now, I get The Idler all these years later, 101 years later, 121 years later. But, you know, so it's not, it doesn't do these kind of stories now. Well, it might do, who knows? It doesn't, but it could do, is what I'm saying. So, yeah, I know somebody, Gary probably, is going to say, you mentioned, so that's the explanation for that. Now, you may say, why didn't I go back? Because, and the answer to that is, I give, out of charitable heart, I want to actually say, well, they both might be right, mightn't they? Well, they can't be both right, can they? Have you not heard of Aristotle and the excluded middle? I believe it was Aristotle. Anyway, Elliot O'Donnell. Oh yeah, I should say, it's Easter Sunday. Well, what are you doing this on Easter Sunday, Tony? Why aren't you spending your time off contemplating all sorts of holy things? Well, I've been out with the dogs, it's a lovely day, it's warm, and I just had this urge on me to do this when things were quiet, because the scrap man is not scrapping today. However, I do have a neighbour 3 down, his hobby is drilling. So his hobby is drilling. Whenever he gets any free time, he drills. His house, I've never been inside it, it must look like a Swiss cheese. It must be full of holes. You would have thought you'd get to the end of the places you can drill, but no. I think he's one of these guys, he's got one of those power tool hammer drills, and he's going to use it, whether there's need for it or not. Anyway, so if you hear, that's him. I can see on the waveform some drill marks, signs of drilling. Anyway, Elliot O'Donnell. Told you where it came from, 1904. Now, Elliot O'Donnell was an interesting guy, really. He was born in 1872 and he died in 1965, so he's not been dead 70 years, so technically this story's probably still in copyright. I just realised that after I'd done it. I thought, well, it was written 121 years ago. Come on, it can't still be in copyright. Well, maybe it isn't, maybe it is. I think it's you're hamstrung if you can't, because then what do? You just do kind of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which I have done, and a few Sherlock Holmes stories. Anyway, so I'm taking a risk, and I'm happy to take it down if somebody objects to me using it, or even pay a reasonable fee for licensing. And this story won't make a lot of money, but that isn't why I'm doing it. But I'm prepared to pay a license fee if it's reasonable as well. Anyway, so he wrote a lot of stories of so-called true ghost stories, and it says that his work is often regarded with a healthy dose of skepticism by serious researchers due to his flamboyant writing style and a penchant for dramatic, often unbelievable anecdotes. So of course with ghost hunting you have the serious people like the Society for Psychical Research and old the Rhymes University, and who's that guy? Dean Radin, that's the one. I read a book of his, and he's he's an academic, but he's a researcher into parapsychology, come out as a believer in the statistically significant power of prayer and magic and things like this. But of course, if you're a scientist and you say things like that, your reputation disappears. But that doesn't mean you're not right. Just the things you're allowed to say, without being laughed at. But that's how scientific revolutions change. Think of old Kuhn and all that guy. Anyway, let's get back to Elliot O'Donnell. He was born in Clifton near Bristol to Reverend Henry O'Donnell and Elizabeth Harrison. His father was murdered in Abyssinia, apparently, when he was quite small. Elliot O'Donnell claimed to descend from Irish Gaelic aristocracy, chieftains of clans and things, and so he had this idealised version of himself. Reminds me of old MacGregor Mathers, who was one of the chiefs of the Golden Dawn, who also, I don't think he was Scottish, but invented this persona as a clan chieftain, So it wasn't uncommon for these flamboyant Victorians to cosplay, I suppose we'd call it now. Anyway, so he went to Clifton College and later went to the Queen's Service Academy in Dublin. He wanted to join, or he thought about joining the Royal Irish Constabulary, and then he thought about joining the army. He was about to sit the exams for the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, but then he travelled a lot and he worked in the USA as a policeman. Was present during the Chicago railway strike in 1894. He came back to England. He pursued a career as a schoolmaster, but also trained as an actor at the Henry Neville School in Oxford Street. You can see the flamboyance. He married Ada O'Donnell, 1905. Now, I don't know if that was her if this can happen, was her maiden name, or it was just a coincidence. He wrote his first psychic thriller apparently in 1904, so he was relatively older at that time. So let me do my maths. 36, called For Satan's Sake. He went on to write novels, mostly occult fantasy, The Sorcery Club, 1912. And then he starts producing these allegedly true ghost stories. And he was really, really popular. Stories of haunted houses, spectral figures, and he talked about his own encounters with the supernatural. And my notes put this rather polite thing on. The veracity of these accounts remains questionable. Nevertheless, he became a bit of a pop authority on the paranormal, and he was invited to investigate supposed hauntings. So he went and he lectured on paranormal topics in both Britain and USA. He wrote extensively for magazines, including Weird Tales, and maintained that he believed in ghosts but was not a spiritualist, because remember that spiritualism at that time was a quasi-religion, really. And we've talked about people's belief in it, Arthur Conan Doyle and all these people. Anyway, so W.B. Yeats, etc., etc. So, people are saying that he was a celebrity ghost hunter, basically. They're not saying that, that's what he was. He was a bit like, and we have had them recently. I mean, I'm thinking of the late Derek Okoro was the star of Most Haunted. He was apparently a very well considered medium in his early days. And then, of course, Ed and Lorraine Warren in the 1970s, who were celebrity demonologists, not a job I'd like. And they were involved in the Amityville Horror in the US, but of course the Enfield Poltergeist in London, and that was The Conjuring 2. Then, of course, the Annabelle doll in Connecticut, and there were a whole bunch of them, you know. Lorraine was a psychic, and Ed was a self-taught demonologist. I suppose there's not many college courses in that, so you'd have to pretty much teach yourself. Anyway, so that's the kind of guy that Elliot was, and he seems to me to be someone who had who was aware of marketing. You know, you knew how to market. He was very poor when he was growing up, and he needed to be able to market himself, and he was a bit flamboyant, a bit theatrical. Kind of reminding of me, really. But there we are. I don't dress up, and I don't claim. Actually, I could, you know, claim that I'm some kind of clan leader and walk around in tartan and speaking Gaelic. Why not? Okay. He died when he was 93. He alludes to, he spices it up with stories, you know, and he mentions in this case the Society for Psychical Research. He apparently did one night at St Nicholas Church, Brockley Combe, with Edward Fielding, an investigator for the Society for Psychical Research, but he didn't actually work for them anyway. And he wrote for Weird Tales, so he was definitely into the popular side of these things. He was 93 when he died. Let's talk about this story, The Haunted Spinney, published 1905, 1904, whichever you prefer. So, it's got that true ghost thing going on, hasn't it? This is a true ghost story. And I thought one of the things, often when I'm reading these stories, certain key themes jump out at me. And particularly, you know, when you're doing ghost stories, you can end up saying the same thing. You can end up harping on the same, and I do. But let's talk about environmental psychology. So what is environmental psychology? There's a guy called Kurt Lewin, who's a social psychologist, and this is in the 80s. He had a thing called field theory, and he even came up with a scientific equation. F, open parentheses, P, comma, E, both capitals, close parentheses, where, so B equals F. B, behavior, equals F, which is, I don't know what F stands for. P is the personal characteristic in their environment. So me, for example, and say me and Sheila, we have different personalities, and she'd be more likely to have some psychic contact than I would. And that's our personalities. And then we have the environment as well. And there was so basically what it says is the environment, certainly. And the reason I mention this in relation to this story is that O'Donnell talks about how there are very few ghosts in pleasant meadows, but they lurk in weird moors with twisted shapes of rocks. It's interesting that anthropomorphism, can't say it, and dark woods and bogs. And the environment clearly, and I think this is the point he's making, has a direct effect on our propensity to experience ghostly things or be frightened. And I suppose environmental psychology, and Kurt Lewin would say, absolutely, that's right, you know. It's the environment, it's to do with the person. Obviously, some people are just not susceptible at all. They're not going to have any kind of experiences like that. But if you are a little bit that way, and they put you in an environment that has these characteristics. So what are these characteristics? Well, let's have a think about this. So pleasant moorlands. My mind jumps, but I recently read Adam S. Leslie's book, Lost in the Garden. I've just finished, by the way, the Mexican Silvia Moreno Garcia, I think, wrote Mexican Gothic. Just finished that. Two very different books. Adam S. Leslie's book set in this eternal summer. It isn't spooky, but whereas Silvia Moreno Garcia's book is set in this House of Usher type place. It's dark, it's got crypts, it's damp, you know. So the reason I'm mentioning these is environment, because certain environments are more threatening. So that is environmental psychology. You may know of the field of evolutionary psychology. So evolutionary psychology explains current behaviours as being relics of our ancestral evolutionary past. So how so one thing I've heard said is that men are more likely to be colourblind because it was the women who gathered the berries. Men are more likely to have spatial awareness because and these are facts, more men are colourblind. Men generally have better spatial awareness. There's nothing controversial in that. It's like saying men are stronger. It's just a biological fact. Or a psychological fact in that case. I don't know if it's psychological, biological, or both. So I'm not, I'm not offending anybody by that. Well, somebody will be offended because what was it Hitchens said? Some people climb up tremendously tall ladders to peer through windows so that they can be offended by something. But that is my intention. My point being, many of these explanations of environmental psychology are really persuasive and plausible, but I'm not sure that evolutionary psychology is what I mean. I'm not sure that evolutionary psychology is massively scientific. So what is science? I'm going to give you in 5 poorly constructed sentences rather than the textbook that is 4,000 pages long, which it deserves. But it's really about empirical observation. So advancing human knowledge through empirical observation, measurement, but there are 2 main ways that science does this, and one is through experiment. That is like the gold standard. Experiments, okay, I'm going to leave those to one side. The other way is through observation. So you think of some types of science struggle to do experiments. So geology and even Darwin wasn't an experimentalist. But you can do kind of, I suppose, experiments, but mainly it's about taxonomy, putting things in order. And so evolutionary psychology isn't that. They're just so stories, like the berries. Well, it might be true, might not be true, might be true. How are you going to prove it? You can't. I suppose they would say they just collect evidence, and when there's a lot of the empirical evidence that shows this, and this, maybe it becomes more persuasive, and that would link in with the natural history type of scientific method, which isn't the experimental method. I mean, there may be people out there, biologists and whatever, and geologists who can do experiments, but that is my general understanding. So I like evolutionary psychology so much I'm going to cite it now. The issue about moorlands, boglands, dense forests, mountain tops being the abode of spirits and scary and numinous is because they actually pose a palpable environmental threat to human life. You can die in those places. That's why they're scarier. That's why we're more on edge. Our anxieties are because they are more dangerous. When we're walking down by a lovely spring brook in an English woodland with the cherry blossom out like I was this morning, it's not frightening. So we're not going to see any ghosts. So the ghosts are related to our heightened anxiety. So I think that's a point he was making. I think that's right. And he makes the point, and the whole point about this haunted spinney, but he says it at the end. The ghosts then disappear. The St Ives people knew, and the ghosts then disappear from the haunted spinney once the explanation was there. So I think what he's saying what I'm saying. He's saying certain places are more liable to procure ghosts for you, but that's because of the place they are, not necessarily because they're an abode of spirits. So I think it's pretty much a rationalist explanation. I think the story is actually rationalist, which ties in with his idea of the Society for Psychic Research. Listen, the Society for Psychic Research isn't about debunking ghosts, not at all. It's about being scientific about it. And then of course that leads us to mention the stone tape theory. This is the stone tape theory, came out by Thomas Charles Lethbridge in the 1960s. And that says that certain places which have had emotional energy, like a murder, imprinted on them by whatever's happened, in some sense, the environment, the stones, this again is an attempt at a scientific theory, the stones of the trees or whatever, are, and then replay it. I don't think this is stone tape, I think this is more environmental psychology, and to the extent Elliot O'Neill talks about how on these moorlands, some of those grotesque stones, they look like people, they've got faces, ooh, that's spooky. He talks about the trees with these branches that look like hands, and it's kind of this I've got that wording and I can't say it, anthropomorphistic. I'm not looking at it now. And there was research done on Mary King's Close, which is, I don't know if you know Edinburgh, the old town. There's a whole level of the city which has been built up on, so it's now underground. And Mary King's Close is a famous haunting place. Of course, there's Greyfriars Kirkyard as well. If you go to Greyfriars Kirkyard, you're surrounded by tombs and all these grinning skulls and memento mori. So this is the point about the environmental effect. I should say, jumping to the one side, both my dad and my uncle, who grew up in a house on the grass market, who backed onto the kirkyard, they talk about hauntings in the house, both of them separately, at different occasions, some years different, told me different stories about things that they'd experienced. So I'm not ruling it out, but I'm just saying, as you can see, how Greyfriars Kirkyard and Mary King's Close. Now, the reason I mentioned Mary King's Close is there were experiments done on this environmental psychology, and it was found that, it had all the tick, 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 tick that you're looking for: gloomy, dark, narrow, all these things which would have been environmental threats, which are environmental threats to people. They provoke just a tick of your anxiety, and you're more on edge, and you're more likely to experience something. So I think Elliot O'Donnell is a rationalist, despite his theatricality. So I think he's talking about environmental psychology a long time before the 1980s and Kurt Lewin. So I wanted to say that about the story. The other thing I wanted to say about the story is looking at the craft, which is related to how the story plays out. So I think we need to talk about the unreliable narrator. So what we would say about so just a quick run through the unreliable narrator, which is a literary device whereby the person who's telling you the story, in this case our unnamed man, I don't think he is named, and we have a instinctive, or we've been set up to believe that the narrator, the convention always was the narrator will tell you the truth, so you can rely on the narrator, and if he says this, then that's the way it was. This isn't like that, because it turns out that we can't rely on the narrator. So it is an unreliable narrator, and it's a literary device, and of course very famously used by Agatha Christie in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, 1926. The difference with that is, if you haven't read the book, this is going to be a spoiler, but I'm presuming because it was written in 1926 and it's famous, that you may well have, or listen to my narration. I've just been closed down from doing Agatha Christie by copyright claims, but it doesn't mean I don't love her work. So the narrator is deliberately obfuscating, is deliberately misleading us in that case. Now, there are other examples where it's not so clear. So Rebecca, Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, 1938. We're not sure if we can rely on the unnamed second wife, because not because she's deliberately trying to mislead us, but because she's so emotionally off kilter because of it. So that's interesting, because it suggests that there are cases where the narrator is not reliable, not because they're deliberate malfeasance, but because they're not able, they don't know, they're not straight in their head themselves. Okay. The other one, of course, is We Have Always Lived in the Castle, Shirley Jackson's 1962. And there's mental illness there, isn't there? So, and then of course, very famously, Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club, when we get to, and that is again probably mental illness, I think, as I recall the story. And that's so the story, if you remember, The Haunted Spinning, as we are presented, is our narrator is going for a walk on the moorland. The only thing that didn't fall true for me was the fact he's wrestling this bloke in a remote woodland in Cornwall, and there's a police officer turns up to help him at the end. I'm like, really, and he gives him a bung. He gives the copper 5 shillings. Well, that's not right, is it? Anyway, does that kind of persuade the police officer? I mean, so basically, going back to the story, he's on this morning, he sees this woman, he decides to go for a walk in the woods. Why? Because he's haunted by the ghost, which is some foreshadowing, really, to his mental state, I think, and also him seeing the twisted hands and thing is a hint, is a foreshadowing by Elliot O'Donnell that this guy's not right in the head, or at least it's not too heavy, because if it was completely heavy-handed, or he's a schizophrenic, he's hallucinating everything, we go, oh, we can't trust this man, but he just gives us enough that when we look back at the end, we go, that's what that was. He wasn't in a good mental state, So there's a bit of foreshadowing there, but not too heavy-handed. So I thought it was quite well done, that. I mean, in general terms, I thought his prose style was serviceable, but without being elegant. And I thought his psychological insights were, all right, but not particularly profound. So I'm not saying it's literature, but it was a fun story. And so it turns out that basically, as I reconstruct it, what was the guy, the other man, the labouring guy, doing there? Well, who knows? Just a coincidence. And then it turns out he's murdered his wife, and he blames it on him. And then, of course, we get the class prejudice and stuff. He's an ignorant labouring man, and he likes a drink. Therefore, he must have done it, and he gets hanged out of sheer prejudice because a gentleman who's giving 5 shillings to the copper couldn't possibly have done it. Oh, there's my chip hurting again. And so, and that's it, really. So what we're saying is it's an unreliable narrator due to his mental state. We need to say something about twist endings. Oh, we need to say something about Cornwall as well. I've got a bit of a Cornish obsession at the moment. I don't know if you picked that up. I don't know how long it'll last, but I just eat pasties all the time now. Yeah, I haven't had a pasty for ages, really, but I'm doing the Cornish, and funnily enough, I went to see Hawkwind the other night. This is weird. Remember, I'm obsessed by Cornish, I'm learning Cornish, and I've seen Hawkwind many, many times, and I'm strolling, the support band's on, and they're singing. I'm sitting there, and I think, they're singing in Cornish. And it gets to the end of the song, and the singer goes, Muraz, which is like, thank you, in Cornish. I'm like, how I'm obsessed by Hawkwind, I'm obsessed by Cornish, and I've never seen a band, this was in Newcastle upon Tyne. It's the furthest you can get from Cornwall and still be in England, they're at opposite ends of the country. So how come, and I've seen Hawkwind, they've never had a Cornish band on before, I've never seen anybody singing Cornish in real life, in my life, so that was weird. Where was that? But getting back to Cornwall. So there's this otherness which in Gothic fiction, and Dracula famously Transylvania, the Fanus, I've forgotten her name, Carmilla, Carinthia. These obscure East European places are used as the other because they are little known. It's a bit like M.R. James's idea about a ghost story. You put a veil between this person. It's got to be at a distance, not too far, but at a distance. So these East European countries counted as that in that literature, and of course classic Gothic stuff, the Italian it's set in the continent of Europe very often, comes home a little bit later on, so it's not true for every case, but Vathek and stuff like that. But Cornwall served that purpose because it's a long way from London, and it had its language. It had until the 18th century, early 19th century potentially, and it was different. It was Celtic. It was misty. It was remote. It had this dramatic landscape, and so it had a rich folklore, and so it serves the same purpose as Transylvania. Cornwall serves the same purpose as Transylvania, as being a veil, a mystical veil. It's a place where mystical things could happen, whereas to your average reader sitting at that time in Birmingham or London, it's probably not going to happen down their street. They use the Dark is Rising trilogy, the 70s kids series used Wales and other parts of the country. So my own Cumbria has been used a bit like that as well sometimes. So it's remote, Scottish Highlands, west of Ireland, all these places. Now, interestingly, I was talking about Mexican Gothic, Silvia Moreno Garcia, and she uses England. The family in it are English, and I guess if you're in Mexico City, England probably feels as a whole quaint and odd and quirky, and it's got lots of ghosts and stone circles and haunted houses and folklore, and they've got lots of windy roads and weird people. So for the Mexicans, England serves the purpose of Transylvania, and I think that's probably for continental Europeans as well. England has that mysticalness. I mean, look at Harry Potter and Tolkien and stuff like that. It's seen as a place where you can have hobbits and magic, but for the English in this story, Cornwall serves that purpose. So that's what I want to say about Cornwall. And I want to talk about twist endings, because there is a twist ending here, and I should have kind of linked that directly to the unreliable narrator and talked about the Cornish thing probably at the beginning. But so let's talk about twist endings. So twist ending is a narrative technique that is frowned on by serious authors, and literary authors think if you use twist endings, you're a common genre author, but the public love them. And so it's where the story goes a certain way and turns at the end, as the ending says, a twist ending. And there are two sources of enjoyment for a reader. One is that pleasant twist at the end. Oh my goodness, I didn't see that coming. And for the clever reader, who prides themselves on their cleverness, he'll be, I saw that coming all along. And of course, classically, that they are used in detective fiction, but horror fiction and all the kind of genre fiction use them as well. But you need to foreshadow, and that's why I think he does that well with our man seeing shapes in the trees, but you haven't got to lay it. I was saying this before, you haven't got to hammer it home, or else you lose the twist. You can't make it obvious, but you need at the end, because if you get to the end and you reveal the twist and there's no foreshadowing, the reader goes, well, that's a swizz. Because it becomes a deus ex machina, which is another literary thing which you mustn't do. You mustn't do it. Although people do it. The Greeks used to do it, of course. The god from the machine, that's where it comes from Greek theatre. The story would be like completely knotted, no solution, and a god appears. And, there we are, sorts it all out. That's a deus ex machina. Listeners, readers don't like that. Modern ones don't. Greeks maybe do. So what kind of twist are there? Well, the unreliable narrator, which we've talked about. You think about Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn, 2012. The diary entries mislead the reader. So the unreliable narrator can be a deliberate misleader, or can be misleading because of their mental state. And there are other, just running through the different kinds of twists, there are 5, 6. So there's unreliable narrator, reversal of identity, and this is very common in Gothic fiction from the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s, whereby somebody who is supposed to be somebody turns out not to be them. So somebody who's living may be dead, somebody who's dead may be living, a hero may be a villain, a victim may be the perpetrator, and that's all achieved through misdirection. In this case, we do have that. We have the perpetrator is probably our narrator. So the reversal of identity in a sense. Reversal of motive, I don't think we have that. Reversal of perception, the classic one is the Planet of the Apes, 1968, where everything's going along and then we think we're on an alien planet and then suddenly we see the Statue of Liberty and oh my goodness! And then of course Lost as well, and it was always doing things like that. Reversal of achievement, we haven't got that there. Great example of this is The Gift of the Magi. I've done that on the Classic Stories podcast. And peripeteia, a term from classical tragedy referring to a reversal of fortune, must arise logically from preceding events and is most powerful when it casts earlier actions in a new light. So that is also reversal of perception. Guy de Maupassant's The Necklace, 1884, exemplifies this with the final revelation that reshapes the entire story. So what I would say is there's lots to be said about this story, as always. It is neatly done, and it is a twist-ending story with an unreliable narrator and a reversal of motive. with what is a supernatural element? When they go back to see the thing happening again. So that is the ghostly bit of it. I think without that it wouldn't work. So it isn't necessarily a supernatural story, but otherwise it's not a bad piece of work. As I say, his prose is not fantastic, but it does the job. I hope you like that. Lots to say, always lots to say, and probably we could spend the whole day talking about these kind of stories, but we're not going to do that. The Lodger in Room 16 by David Dixon. There was something rather odd about the lodger in Room 16, and Mr. Thief didn't think he could stand any more of it. Right now, he was stooped at the keyhole of his next-door neighbour like a huge bald-headed bird looking for worms. But all he could see was the corner of a crude, hefty wooden table which told him nothing it had not told him on many previous inspections. His innate timidity restricted his investigations to the daylight hours, when he knew the lodger must be out, and it was only during these hours that he tried the door. It was always locked. A little later, Mr. Thief left the lodging house in a very determined frame of mind. He walked briskly in a district of empty warehouses and dilapidated buildings. Evening was drawing in. The streets were always deserted after dark, due jointly to marauding packs of vandals and a strange series of disappearances which had plagued the area for years. This suited Mr. Thief perfectly. He had on a black overcoat 2 sizes too big for him, and which he seldom took off, and pebble-glass spectacles that magnified his eyes to look like slugs wallowing darkly in axle grease. He was panting, for he always tended to walk faster than he was fit for. It was trying to rain. Mr. Thief had a rolled-up newspaper under an arm when he returned to the lodging house some 10 minutes later. A bar of yellow light beneath the door of the ground-floor stairs betrayed the presence of the landlord within. Mr. Thief delivered one startling rap on the door with a knuckle. "Go away," commanded a muffled voice. Mr. Thief stood his ground. He waited 2 whole minutes patiently, then delivered a second stunning rap on the door. There followed a muffled curse and the door was snatched open. The landlord glared down at the bent bird-like figure before him, whose spectacles reflected the light of the room to look like dim headlamps in its face. "Well?" he barked impatiently. Mr. Thief insinuated himself into the room, which was packed to the ceiling with a scruffy and rusty collection of junk. The landlord shut the door with unnecessary loudness as Mr. Thief explained his visit. "I wish to speak with you, Mr. Moole, about certain disturbances on the top floor which are making my stay here difficult." "I haven't the time for it," snapped the landlord. "If I remember correctly, Mr. Thief, you took that room on the understanding that if it wasn't to your satisfaction, you'd find another elsewhere. That's my understanding of the matter, Mr. Thief, and I'll thank you to remember that you demanded that room and made a nuisance of yourself about it after I told you them rooms up there wasn't fit for letting. And I'll thank you to remember that I didn't show you the top floor or offer you a room anywhere. You found it yourself. Nevertheless, Mr. Moole, these disturbances must stop," said Mr. Thief with determination. "I don't know what number 16 is up to, but I think that as the landlord you should be concerned about it. I believe that something is being willfully and maliciously destroyed in there at night, sometimes as much as 3 times a week, sir. There seems to be a crank-handled device in there which sounds rusty to me, Mr. Moole, and the machine's task involves a sound that I can only describe as that of crunching sticks. Crunching sticks, Mr. Moole, is as near as I can describe it. In fact, it was intolerable. The disturbances always lasted about 45 minutes and were thunderous, the shuddering noise seeming to interfere with every atom of Mr. Thief's body. They could occur on any night and at any hour after dark. Mr. Thief feared most of all those that happened in the small hours, when his sleep would be troubled by appalling dreams, and he would wake in a cold sweat in the dark. and find himself listening to that infernally chilling sound, the scraping, ponderous turn of the crank handle, and the sound of crunching sticks. The paranoid degree of anxiety that he felt at those times seemed to bring him to the brink of insanity. "Is that all you wanted to say, Mr. Feet?" "Indeed, I believe I hardly need say more to arouse your professional concern, Mr. Moore." "Then no doubt you'll be anxious to leave," said the landlord, turning to the door. "Let's not go poking our nose into other people's business, Mr. Feet. The man in number 16 works in a local cemetery, and would not be pleased at your interest in his affairs, I've no doubt. You took that room on the understanding that if you had any complaints, you'd find another elsewhere. My advice is to do just that." "Wait a moment," Mr. Feet protested. Now, said the landlord, helping him out through the door. "That's all I got to say on the matter, and that's that." Back in his room with the door locked, Mr. Feet stood at his window thoughtfully. The view here was plotted with archaic roofs and chimneys of various sizes and shapes, and part of a cinema could be seen amidst them, its neon signs lighting up his face dimly pink, then blue, then pink again. After trying the crossword, Mr. Feet took his Daily Telegraph apart and changed some of the old newspaper sheets on his bedroom. He worked by the glow of the cinema signs, for he liked to save on electricity. He went to bed much later with a sick lump of dread in his stomach, and slept fitfully all night. The house remained tomb-like in its silence, however, and this was not what Mr. Feet had expected. The following morning he rose in a very grim mood, for the constant dread of nights was becoming insufferable. Though the disturbances were by no means regular, the lapses between them never exceeded 5 nights, and last night had been the 5th. He would have to look forward to a disturbance all over again, this time with the certainty of no reprieve. Mr. Feet was furious. He brushed his teeth venomously in the 4th-floor bathroom, and after a wrathful shave, emerged in the gloomy corridor with small pieces of pink lavatory paper pressed on his bleeding jowls. The fact that the man worked among the dead and committed God knew what crimes after dark did not frighten Mr. Feet a bit now, but he was angry. When he got back to his room, he wrote out a very stiff note in which he advised the recipient that should the disturbances continue, he would have no further recourse but to notify the police. He slipped a note under the door of number 16 and waited perfunctorily for signs of response, but, of course, there were none. He tried the door, but it was locked. He then left the lodging house to pick up his dole money, for it was Thursday. He bore a plastic carrier bag that contained library books due for replacement. It was dark when he returned, and it was trying to rain again. Behind the lodging house was a pitch-dark, cobbled square. It lay by the side of a road that fortunately was well enough lit. On the outside of the road to the square, Mr. Feet emerged from a beaten path that was crowded by trees and wild vegetation. The bank of verdure at his right screened a cemetery of considerable age, reputedly, though it couldn't be connected with his next-door neighbour since it had been abandoned to riotous vegetation long ago. The soil here smelt overpoweringly rich and nutritious, and the wild weeds beyond the trees were gigantic, with stems as thick as Mr. Feet's wrists. Walking briskly, Mr. Feet disappeared into the square, where he met with something of an accident. For he had forgotten that the dustbins belonging to the buildings on the 3 sides of the square were always strung across its centre. He'd formerly complained of this to the landlord on many occasions, for it constituted a danger at night. He'd even been able to describe a lodger whom he believed guilty of placing the obstruction, a small, mad-looking skeleton of a man, with shriveled eyes and a dry, cynical voice, who in the summer always walked down to the newspapers in overcoat, pyjamas and slippers. Mr. Feet's collision was thunderous. He was just getting the hang of his prostate circumstances when a sash window slammed open above. The light of the obscured street lamp nearest the square flooded over a wall and illuminated a double-barreled shotgun as it peered furtively out of a window halfway up the back of one of the lodging houses. The dry, hairless head of Mr. Feith's dustbin suspect appeared cautiously behind the weapon. "Who goes there?" it barked. Mr. Feith conveyed his identity and circumstances with restrained exasperation and announced that he would deliver a written complaint to the landlord about the dustbins. "You leave them bloody dustbins be," the old man retorted with hostility. "I saw someone coming out by that old cemetery down there just now, Mr. Feet, and I've got this here notion maybe it was you. You keep well away from that place. That's my advice to you." Having by now regathered his library books and repositioned his spectacles, Mr. Feith remained politely to inquire what the devil the madman was talking about. "If you can't take advice without asking bloody questions all the time, you don't bloody well deserve any. I've been here a long time, Mr. Feet, and I got a sharp eye in my head. That there is the devil's graveyard, and woe betide any man that gets himself buried in it." Mr. Feith assured the old man that he had no intentions of being interred there. "You just hope and pray that that might be the case, and God be thanked," said the old man darkly, "for there is a great evil at large in this godless neighbourhood, with folks being nicked out of their very beds a night these many years," he added, crossing himself feverishly. "And what does this devil look like, then?" Mr. Feith inquired contemptuously. "Does he have horns like the books have it, and a tail?" "He don't look healthy, Mr. Feith," said the old man with a shudder, "and that's no exaggeration. He's horribly fat and grey. He looks rotten, Mr. Feet, soft and rotten like an overripe plum. And then there's his head." "What's wrong with that?" "I don't like to think on it," said the old man with horror. "You keep well away from that place, that's my advice to you. You'll be good enough to set that dustbin up before you go, else I'll not rest peaceful in my bed tonight." Mr. Feith couldn't stand this old man, whose personal abandon and madness represented the very depths of human degradation. Indeed, it was only with the nauseous taste in his mouth that he was able to associate with anybody reduced to living in a house of this quality. He was fortunate with the timing of the disturbance that night. Instead of having to wait up half the night in order to avoid having his sleep poisoned with it, he had to listen to it somewhat before midnight while the cinema lights were still on. The sound began with a familiar scraping screech of what Mr. Feith took to be a crank handle. This continued at brief, regular intervals, punctuating the ceaseless muffled crunching sticks noise, which then commenced. Thereafter, Mr. Feith's room was filled and ravaged by the physical presence of noise. The dust on the floor rose up and hung like a ground mist over the floorboards. Mr. Feith found it hard to believe that nobody beneath heard this racket, and once again the inevitable question rose in the thunder. What on earth was his neighbour doing in there? Even through the rubber soles of his slippers he could feel the boards throb in rhythm with the activity in the next room. The vibration would deaden his ankles soon into an unaccountable numbness, and the dust would scour his lungs. In exasperation, Mr. Feith did something he had often thought of doing before, but in the dark hours had always lacked the character for. He took almost 2 minutes to turn the key in his door as noiselessly as possible and crept down the corridor to the door of room 16. The sound here was so quiet that until he reached the door he suspected that it might have stopped. The door glowed dimly around its edges and at the keyhole. Mr. Feith stooped and applied his eye to the keyhole. The light within was tremulous, and its unsteadiness seemed to increase and subside with the scraping turn of the crank handle. Mr. Feith thought it might be that of a candle, and wondered why his neighbour didn't use his electricity. The view was dominated by the corner of the crude table, as was to be expected, but Mr. Feith's attention was drawn by something else, something that he couldn't quite get the hang of at first. It overhung the edge of the table a little, and seemed to be of an apricot hue with bluish discolouring. It was badly crumpled. Mr. Feith thought it might be made of some kind of flexible rubber. It wobbled and vibrated with the same throbbing rhythm as that of the unseen candle, and it sometimes advanced jerkily down over the edge of the table, which seemed to strain to the same rhythm, though it appeared to be stoutly made. Mr. Feith wondered if the rubber thing might be some kind of long-sleeved glove, since he suspected that he could make out the fingers. But as the sleeve grew longer and longer, he became doubtful. He didn't like the texture of it at all. He remained long enough to watch the seam shudder and strain once more, and to see the rubber oddity on the table make one further jerky reach for the bottom of his field of view. Then he rose to go. Unfortunately, he applied his weight to the door handle, for his back was not what it had been. When his weight was at its greatest, he lost his grip. The handle made a thunderous clunk in its housing, and Mr. Feith found, to his stunned alarm, that the door stood 6 inches ajar. It opened to the left, so that he could see nothing of his neighbour, but it was clear that his neighbour was aware of his presence and had stopped work. Mr. Feith could hear quite plainly now the slow, wheezing respiration of the man inside, who sounded grotesquely fat and bronchial. Mr. Feith had never previously heard so much as a footstep of him. It occurred to him that he might enter and communicate his grievances in person, and it was no doubt this very idea which precipitated his hasty retreat, in which he cared little for the racket he made. He locked his door hastily and drew his armchair against it. He stood by his window, perhaps because it presented a comforting token of egress. While waiting, his dimly blue, then pink, then blue face was frozen with apprehension. After a few minutes, however, the grinding scrape of the crank handle announced the resumption of his neighbour's mysterious labours, and Mr. Feith opened his window to let in some fresh air. The following day, he descended the dark stair flights in a very determined frame of mind indeed. "What the devil do you want now?" the landlord snarled, snatching open his door. I wish to speak to you about that man in room 16, said Mr. Feith firmly. He tried to insinuate himself into the landlord's room, but physical obstruction on the latter's part kept him out. Mr. Feith could see dozens of food mixers in their boxes stacked up amongst the cluttered junk within. Mr. Moole was in the habit of receiving at regular intervals, usually at night, large consignments of cassette radios, watches and other valuables of this kind, and furtive men visited him frequently. Mr. Feith had never been in any doubt but that Mr. Moole had business of dark merit and doubtful honour on the side. "I think I already told you to keep your nose out of his affairs, Mr. Feith, and if you had any brains, you wouldn't forget it so easy." Mr. Feith was determined not to be offended. "As I was going to say, this man started a disturbance last night, and I looked through the keyhole and observed candlelight in the room." Mr. Feith proceeded to describe what he had seen through the keyhole. He didn't mention how he had accidentally opened the door, nor the threatening note he had rashly delivered, which now weighed so heavily on his peace of mind. "I suspect that something is being willfully and maliciously destroyed up there at night, and I submit, Mr. Moole, that it must stop. I suggest we take a key upstairs, the pair of us, and have a look inside." "I don't have a key to number 16, said the landlord. Mr. Feet couldn't hide his astonishment.
Do you mean to say that you don't have a spare key to one of your own rooms, Mr. Moore?
I do, enunciated the landlord. Mr. Feet became uncomfortably aware of one particular eye, roomy and bloodshot, bulging at him belligerently. The man in number 16 is no lodger of mine, Mr. Feet. He came with the house and is none of my business. Or yours.
I don't believe I understand, Mr. Moore.
I couldn't care less, Mr. Feet. Mr. Feet thought of something else. And that's another thing. Why is it that you're prepared to do the rounds for everybody knocking on their doors for their rent money, while I have to come down here to pay mine?
It seems a little unfair, doesn't it?
I never go on the top floor, Mr. Feet, and don't plan to change my habits. I don't need any trouble round here, for reasons you'll no doubt understand, and I'd advise you to keep your nose to yourself. If it's a cheap roof over your head you want, that's all I got to say on it. And that's that. Back on the top floor, Mr. Feet stooped to the keyhole of room 16, but all he could see was the corner of the table in the gloom. The strange rubber thing had gone. Then he tried the room, and something unexpected happened. It opened. The room seemed to have been left for his inspection. He opened the door wider and stepped to the threshold of the room. A timid peer revealed the occupant to be absent. The object that stole his attention was the table in the middle of the room, or at least the filthy machinery that it supported. Apart from this, the room was a little furnished. There was a battered wardrobe at one end, and curtains of grimy cobwebs hung on each side of the little window. The thick carpet of dust was badly scuffed around the room. There was a reek of old sacks and God knew what else in the room. The sight of the mangle made Mr. Feet feel ill. It was bolted on the table excessively, and the table was extensively strutted underneath with ironwork, and itself was bolted to the floor. The rollers were almost as big as dustbins. One of them was set into the table, with only about 3 inches protruding, while the height of the other appeared to be adjustable. An adjustable flap of rubber hung against the upper roller on the output side, covering the gap beneath. A badly stained gutter ran round the far side of the table at an angle, and a battered, filthy-looking bucket stood underneath its end, covered with a ragged scrap of matting. The whole contraption was perhaps the most repulsive thing he had ever seen. Gingerly, Mr. Feet entered the room. The electric lighting consisted of stripped wires hanging uselessly in cobwebs from a hole in the ceiling, and Mr. Feet supposed that the furry mass of cobwebs by the wardrobe must be the slot meter. The wardrobe contained a dirty pile of sacks and 2 slugs. It also contained dozens of crudely fashioned wax-like objects that resembled the half-used candle he found under a window, a misshapen oddity welded onto an enamel plate in its own wax. There was a primitive tinderbox on the windowsill with blobs of dirt all over it. Mr. Feet could see no signs of his threatening note anywhere. He wondered why he'd been allowed in, or if the occupant had simply slipped up. Outside it was raining hard. The monotonous murmurs and mutterings of it had been a constant companion for Mr. Feet all morning. He looked idly out of the window, though he couldn't see very clearly through the rain patterns on the glass. The flat grey wash of the courtyard and the green of the trees beyond were discernible. Sometimes even these were obliterated when sudden gusts of wind lashed the back of the house with rain. Mr. Feet began to suspect that through the rivulets of water on the glass he could make out an unexpected form near the trees by the abandoned cemetery. He pressed his nose against the glass and peered into the rain. He could hardly see much better, and the condensation on this side of the glass caused by his breath wasn't helping much. It was unquestionably a man. He looked bloodless, large and repulsively fat, and seemed to have something black and shiny, perhaps an oilskin, in one mushy-looking hand. Mr. Feet did not think the head should look as mushy and featureless as it did. He became overwhelmed with a giddy sickness at the sight of the man. The man was gazing up the back of the house, and the possibility that he was aware of Mr. Feats peering at him from the window of room 16 could not be discounted. Mr. Feats ducked out of sight. Perhaps he was being imaginative. But if the mysterious man in room 16 looked like anything, surely he would look like that thing outside, like some kind of maggot that crawled out of the soil to commit obscene crimes amongst humanity at night. Mr. Feats believed that he had been discovered in his snooping by the very man who occupied the room. Perhaps it had been a smell in the room, or perhaps Mr. Feats was overreacting, but for the rest of that day he felt very ill indeed and confined himself to his room with the door locked. His illness seemed, if anything, to worsen as night drew in. He had seated himself on the square of hardboard that served to protect his backside from the vicious springs of his gutted armchair. He sat like this until late into the night, unable to move, the cold dampness of the climate drenching him to his bones. Late that night, Mr. Feats was roused from his stupor by the sound of a slow, heavy tread on the top of the stairs, and a vaguely familiar wheezing noise. Mr. Feats listened, barely breathing, as the tread proceeded down the landing, the wheezing sound getting louder. It passed room 16 and came towards the only other door at this end, that of Mr. Feats. The tread stopped outside Mr. Feats' door, and nothing could be heard for a bit except the wheezing. Mr. Feats, in the neon-lit gloom of his room, remained frozen where he sat, numbed with terror and dismay. His visitor then began to grope on the surface of the door. The sound of this was horribly soft and unmethodical. Soon the door handle was struck a couple of times, then turned. As the door strained and cracked behind him, Mr. Feats shrieked without restraint. Rotten bits of wood spat out from around the lock and scattered on the floor, and as the door split asunder, a sickening stench of wet soil and dead cats invaded the room. In common with Mr. Feats' life, his disappearance passed unnoticed by the world in which he lived. His screams wandered along all the dark corridors of the house for over a minute, but no one stirred. Some 50 minutes later, the tread of a descender could have been heard on the stairs, and a bronchial wheezing, which some of the lodgers might have noticed before in the house, but nobody reported it to the police. A suspicious lodger on the ground floor might have been able to furnish the police with a description of the descender, since the hall light, unlike those of the upper corridors and the stairs, was kept in serviceable order, and it remained switched on day and night. But the hall was deserted when the man on the stairs arrived. No one was there to see the descender in such detail, or to smell the appalling reek of corruption that hung around him, and no one was there to connect the screams with the hideous burden that he had slung over his shoulder, a filthy oilskin sack, which had in it something half as massive and heavy, something that filled the sack like laundry, and bobbed up and down rather flabbily on his back as he made his way out. So that was The Lodger in Room 16 by David Dixon. Now, I got this from an anthology anthologized by Mary Danby, one of 3 volumes that I have. This one's called 65 Great Spine Chillers, actually published by St. Michael, which was a publishing arm of Marks and Spencer's back in the early 80s. And Mary Danby was one of the great anthologizers of horror stories, and a writer in her own right, of course, a successful author in her own right. For a long time, I associated her with Richard Dolby, who he was another great anthologizer of ghost stories in the same period. And I misread them as having the same name, and in my mind, they were married. But they're not, obviously. They maybe don't even know each other. I suspect they do know each other. Anyway, enough of that. So David Dixon, let's say something about David Dixon. That is, I don't know anything about him. So I found this story on page 209 in that volume I just talked about. And when I looked at the credits, because it's in copyright, I would imagine still, it wasn't reprinted by Mary Danby from any other. It was the permission of the author. I looked for him on Amazon and on the internet, and I can't find him. Possibly because David Dixon is a relatively common name, and there are lots of David Dixons, but they're mostly David C. Dixon. There's even a kind of dark fantasy writer called David Dixon, but I don't think it's the same guy. If you know who he is, retrospectively, I'd like his permission to do the story, and I'll tell you what, I'll split the proceeds half and half with him, although I would advise him not to shell out too much in anticipation. Maybe a latte and a blueberry muffin his half might buy that. So you might say, Tony, why are you doing another copyright story when you just had your face punched for copyright issues? Well, I would love permission to use it, and because I think it's a really important story in many ways, even though I don't know anything to say about him, and I'd like to know about him. But let's talk about where this story fits. So on the face of it, it's an 80s story potentially. It feels like it might be set in the 80s or the 70s or the 60s or the 50s or the 40s, and we'll say more about that. Let's look at what was happening in horror. Was the so-called splatterpunk, which was an American phenomenon. Think about people like Poppy Z. Bright, David J. Show, John Skipp, Craig Spector. And so what this was about, it erupted out of the genteel sort of ghost story, hammer horror of the 50s. They're sort of very British. Splatterpunk's a very American thing, and transgressive, sort of provocative. Lots of gore, and it's against the cinema background where we're having lots of gory chainsaw massacres and grossness in the film. Not my favourite thing, really. And, mutilation, disease, torture, often sexual pornographic things, flirting with gender identities in some cases. So it's grim, is my point. At the same time, we see, and I think it's a false friend. When you're learning languages, as I'm doing at the moment because it's on my mind, you have false friends, words that look like a word, and you think, that's what that means, and it doesn't. So if we look at what was happening in the UK, around the same period, with roots going further back, we have people like Ramsey Campbell, we have people like Ian Banks's The Wasp Factory, we have Clive Barker's Books of Blood and Hellraiser. And they seem to fit pretty neatly. Maybe Campbell, let's put him slightly to one side. But certainly many of these stories, certainly Books of Blood and The Wasp Factory, are grim, violent tales. Ian Banks' Wasp Factory, because it's in a Scottish landscape, and I think that's a key point here. Hellraiser has its roots. Barker's work has its roots in fantasy. There's a lot of fantasy in it. But the point is, where this story, the David Dixon story, fits in, is, if we look at it, it's this grim story with, the violence isn't particularly described graphically, but it's certainly there. And, the impression is that people are being mangled to death. And so it's definitely that shockness, which I think has some things in common with the American splatterpunk, and certainly The Wasp Factory, and lots of other stuff that was going on. And I think some of Ramsey Campbell's work, can be shockingly like that. But they also have this, and also some of Neil Gaiman's work. I was going to mention Neil Gaiman. his stuff like Feeders and Eaters, which is about what it suggests, has that grossness that is, that we see in this story. We've seen some of Ramsey Campbell's work, this quite unpleasant graphical violence or allusions to graphical violence. What's in your mind is not just somebody getting a slap, it's kind of pretty gruesome. But the point I'm making, I mean, Gaiman, like Clive Barker, more so than Clive Barker, is interested in the mythological and the fantastical and the fairy worlds, and he tends to, but the Sandman, that also had that kind of flirting, particularly the recent series, the flirting with gender and things like that, although something that's produced in the 2020s we probably shouldn't compare with the 90s, so of the 80s rather, the early 80s, and because probably the Sandman film series is a product of the 2020s, despite having its roots much earlier in his work. So yes, that's true. It can be seen as a sister to American splatterpunk, but this grim, and also actually as I was reading it I was thinking of Lovecraft stories like The Rats in the Walls, or particularly the musical like Zan, these tumble down horrible houses, or The Dreams in the Witch House, particularly this lodging house with all sorts of strange stuff going on in it, so so that it's like a glitter ball, isn't it, in a disco where it's the light splinters all over. So there's echoes of Lovecraft, there's echoes of American splatterpunk, but there's also echoes of this grim portrayal of British working class or non-working class poverty and deprivation, as we might call it now, that is very characteristic of these kind of stories. They're set in this 1980s grimness of Britain that is in Scotland. It's the schemes, council estates, I think we call them projects in the US, where people with no hope and no money and are left to rot basically. Maybe that's unfair on some of the politicians' attempts to make things better. Yeah, it's an easy shot to say they're just liars and cheats, isn't it? But let's be charitable and say that some of the politicians, the local politicians, whatever, did want to make these things better for people. Anyway, so what I also see in this is Robert Aikman before things like The Hospice, things like Ringing the Changes. So The Hospice is he goes to this bizarre English, very English, weird hotel on the edge of town where people eat a lot, and he gets bricked in a bedroom with a man in pajamas, and of course Ringing the Changes when they go to this very recognisably grim sea coast, out of season hotel where you can imagine your feet sticking to the carpets, and that has bizarre residents in, and whereas Aikman certainly isn't graphically violent like this, there are echoes, and he's much earlier, he's 50, 60. So my point is that and in that period, I was just reading a book about Harold Wilson by Alan Johnson, and talking about the films, The Angry Young Man, about these in the 50s, about working class people fighting against privilege, and they live in grim, squalid places. It's always rainy and grim. And of course, I think this story makes a fantastic use of the British weather. I think I was, whatever. I think I've been hot. I live in the north of England, of course. Once, 2 days in the past 3 years. Even last summer, I spent last summer with my coat and hat on, and that is not untypical. And so this sense of the grey, the damp cold. There was a YouTube thing of this American guy gone to Glasgow and was saying how it's not cold in the sense of Canada or Siberia, but it's this damp cold. Whereas, when it gets really cold, I don't know because I don't live in those places, but I understand. It's like the dry heat, isn't it? If there's no moisture in the air, it's more tolerable. It's not very tolerable, but it's more tolerable. Whereas we have this damp, clinging greyness that goes on for week after week and is really, really depressing. I don't know if you're picking that up from my voice. I've had a cold for I mean, I haven't got a cold, but my voice, you can probably hear it squeaking. Anyway, so when we look at the state of sort of Ian Aikman, but certainly these 80s stories and the grimness of how Britain is for many people, I'm not trying to run the place down either. I think it's got a lot going for it. I wish we would think of that. I wish we would remember that, actually. You know, certainly we have wallowed in this grossness, this horribleness. And I say, and we might call it, my last point here is, we might call it post-imperial. So Britain, after the Second World War, was bankrupted by the cost of fighting. And remember, standing alone at some point against Nazi Germany. I don't want to make a point, but it's something like we lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers while the Germans and the Soviets were still allies. So anyway, there we go. There's a bit of patriotism there. So when we look back at things like Friedrich Engels in the 19th century, he wrote a book called The Conditions of the English Working Class, or The Condition of the Working Class in England, which shows the utter poverty of, and this was at the height of empire, you know, the utter poverty and degrading conditions of the working class. So I think there's ever since, I mean, probably, you know, even the rural workers probably had a pretty hard time as well. But certainly ever since there's been industrialisation, there has been this. So I think to say it's just post-industrial or post-imperial is to miss the point. The conditions of poor people in England and in Scotland and in Wales and you know, even they may not like me to say it, in Ireland as well, were, you know, fairly grim. I mean, they might not like me to say it because they might not think I had a right to say it, as it's an independent country, and Northern Ireland, of course, is part of the United Kingdom. Oh, it's political, isn't it? I mean, I was conscious of that talking about Neil Gaiman, you know, it's like walking on hot potatoes. So, but I'm going to determine to skirt all of those things. But my point is, and I've made my point again, although we may call this a late 20th century, it's still true for people now. It was true for people when Engels was writing about them. So ever since there have been industrialised cities and now post-industrial cities, there's been this grim life. But I think David Dixon, coming back to David Dixon, I gave him a lot of credit for using the weather to convey this deadening, this soul-deadening damp grimness. And of course he uses the environmental descriptions of the cobwebbed room, the filth, the dust carpet, the filth, and the fact this guy, the dustbins, he knocks the dustbin over, he goes to get his dole, which is of course his social security money. So this man has no joy. He goes to the library, at least it was a library that had books then, you know, he uses that, the social. So in a sense let's jump aside slightly and look at the purpose of this writer. So he's not writing a love story. If he was writing a love story, he might, I know this is an American story, but he might write 500 Days of Summer and it was all sunny and they're going for dates, and I know it all breaks down, you know, but I'm sorry if that's a spoiler, but you know, it's a different kind of story. If he was writing a spy novel, also many British spy novels, John le Carré, Graham Greene, etc., were grim. Not Fleming, of course, not Ian Fleming, but this grim grey world, you know. The writer uses whatever kind of world he wants to convey the emotion he wants. So remember, so many times stories are emotion machines. They are intended to create feelings in you, the listener, the reader. So if I was writing a love story, I would in the same city that David Dixon set this story, I wouldn't put it in that part. I put in, you know, a place where they could go to Italian restaurants and they went skating or something, you know, and it was all lovely, and you know, it was lovely. So we may say that this is a commentary of how it is, but it's not. It's an artifice. And there may be, and there are places like this. Without, I can go and walk my dog through them within 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 10 minutes actually. If I walk straight over, I'm not going to say where it is. But we have to remember that this is not how Britain is, although, we could write a PhD thesis about how all this kind of grim horror reflects the true reality of suffering of poor people in Britain. Yeah, absolutely. But at the same time, in the same city, there are love stories being written, there are spy stories being written, and the author selects those situations. So none of this is true. It is just it's like that mirror ball, isn't it? It just reflects a facet of people's experience. Because even we hope that if this man had gone a different way on a spring day, like I've just been, there's been some sunshine, not sunshine like you get, but sun behind only about 3 layers of clouds, so it wasn't completely dark and grey. But I went out and the snowdrops are still out, there were crocuses, which is my favourite flower, and I even saw some daffodils, first 3 daffodils. I mean, it was really cold. I did have my hat and gloves on and my coat, but this guy could have gone on a nice walk in a park and seen some ducks, because it's very hard to be depressed in a world that has ducks. If you feel a bit down, just go and watch some ducks. Just watch them doing their duck thing, and I'm sure it'll help. Anyway, so it's a pity I don't know more about David Dixon. I would like to know more about him. If he's still alive and still writing, please encourage him to get in touch, and I will give him half of what I make on this, which again won't be a lot of money, but that's not why we do it. And so I'm answering my point, why do another story that may be in copyright and maybe get in trouble? Because I think it's a story that deserves to be heard, because I think it says interesting things, or it allows me to say interesting things. There we go. Okay, I hope you're well, hope everything's good. I'm going to now edit this. What? You edit it? To the sound of Led Zeppelin 2.